Now, widowed and struggling to maintain appearances, she had invested everything in securing advantageous marriages for her three daughters. The eldest, Catherine, had married an elderly but wealthy baron last season. The youngest, Elizabeth, was only 17 and promised to be a true beauty. That left Jane, the middle daughter, the family's greatest disappointment. "Your hair is coming loose already," her mother said, reaching to tuck a wayward strand back into place. "And couldn't you have worn the blue gown? It brings a touch more colour to your complexion." "The blue gown has a tear in the sleeve," Jane replied quietly, not adding that she had discovered it while altering the garment to fit Elizabeth, who had borrowed it without asking. Her mother's face softened. "Well, no matter. Lady Pembroke's literary gatherings are hardly hunting grounds for eligible gentlemen. Just try to engage in conversation this time, dear. Your silence is often mistaken for haughtiness." Jane swallowed the bitter reply that rose to her throat. Her silence was not haughtiness, but self-preservation. 7 seasons of rejection had taught her that hopeful participation only led to greater humiliation. "I shall try, mother." The carriage ride to Lady Pembroke's Portland Square residence passed in uncomfortable silence. Jane stared out the window, watching London's fashionable streets scroll past. Spring had painted the city in vibrant greens and bursts of colourful blooms, making her own drab existence feel all the more pronounced. Lady Pembroke's literary salon was known throughout London as a gathering place for intellectuals, artists, and the occasional aristocrat seeking cultural cachet. Jane had been invited only because Lady Pembroke had been her godmother and felt some obligation to Elena Kensington's middle daughter. These evenings were both torture and respite for Jane. Torture because she remained as invisible here as elsewhere, but respite because no one expected her to dance or flirt or attempt to secure a husband. "Miss Kensington, how delightful," Lady Pembroke said, her voice warming as she greeted them in her opulent drawing-room. "And Elena, you look well. I've seated you near Lady Harrington. She's just returned from Italy and has the most scandalous stories about the young English gentleman touring there." Jane slipped away as her mother was swept into conversation, finding refuge near the bookshelves. She ran her fingers along the leather spines, taking comfort in these silent companions that had sustained her through years of loneliness. Unlike the fashionable novels that occupied her sisters, Jane preferred histories, poetry, and translations of Greek and Roman classics, works that transporting her far from the marriage market of London society. "Ah, Miss Kensington." She turned to find Professor Hughes, a kindly academic from Cambridge who had taken an interest in her intellectual pursuits over the past year. "I've brought you something," he said, producing a slim volume from his coat pocket. "A new translation of Sappho's fragments, not entirely suitable for a young lady, perhaps, but I thought you might appreciate it nonetheless." Jane accepted the book with genuine pleasure. "How thoughtful, thank you. Your opinions on Herodotus last month were most insightful. It's refreshing to find a young person with such a keen mind for historical context." She felt herself blushing at the rare compliment. "You are too kind, sir." "Not at all. In fact," he broke off suddenly, his attention drawn to the entrance. "Good heavens, is that the Duke of Queensberry? I had no idea he was back in England." Jane followed his gaze to the doorway where a tall figure had appeared, his commanding presence causing a ripple of murmurs throughout the room. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking his identity. Vincent Queensberry, the 6th Duke of Queensberry, had returned to London after nearly 5 years abroad. His reputation had preceded him for years, brilliant, brooding, eccentric, and firmly committed to bachelorhood after a disastrous near engagement in his youth. The gossips claimed he had exiled himself to his archaeological pursuits in Greece and Egypt to escape the persistent matchmaking of London's ambitious mothers. Jane had never seen him in person before, though his scholarly articles on ancient civilizations had been published in several journals she followed devotedly. She had always imagined him as an older, stooped academic, not the vital man who now stood surveying the room with detached amusement. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that suggested both intellect and strength, high forehead, straight nose, firm jaw partially obscured by a neatly trimmed beard. His hair, dark as midnight with distinguished touches of silver at the temples, was longer than fashion dictated. Everything about him spoke of a man unconcerned with society's trivial expectations. "They say he's cataloguing his findings for the British Museum," Professor Hughes whispered. "A remarkable collection of Greek artifacts, I hear, what I wouldn't give for a private viewing." "Indeed," Jane murmured, trying to appear merely curious rather than captivated. She watched as Lady Pembroke greeted the Duke effusively, her hand lingering on his arm as she guided him into the room. Society might forgive his eccentricities and prolonged absence, but his title, fortune, and the ancient Queensberry estates ensured his welcome in any drawing-room in England. Jane retreated further into the shadow of the bookcase, clutching Professor Hughes' gift. Men like the Duke of Queensberry inhabited a different world, one where brilliant, beautiful people discussed great ideas and embarked on grand adventures. Her world was confined to shabby drawing rooms, disappointed glances, and the slow erosion of hope. The evening progressed predictably. Jane drifted from the bookshelves to the refreshment table and back again, occasionally exchanging pleasantries with elderly gentlemen or married ladies who required no entertainment. She overheard fragments of conversations about the Duke, his expedition to the Valley of the Kings, his collection of rare manuscripts, his refusal to attend Almack's despite personal invitations from the patronesses. She was examining a marble bust of Homer when a deep voice spoke behind her. "The sculptor took liberties with his features, I fear. No contemporary accounts describe Homer as quite so distinguished." Jane turned to find herself face to face with the Duke of Queensberry. Up close, his eyes were startling, a penetrating blue-grey that seemed to evaluate and catalogue everything they observed. "Perhaps artistic interpretation serves a purpose beyond mere accuracy, Your Grace," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. "We prefer our heroes to look heroic." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, followed by a fleeting spark of interest. "A practical perspective, Miss Kensington, Jane Kensington." "Miss Kensington," he inclined his head slightly, "you have an interest in classical sculpture." "In history generally, Your Grace. Though I confess my knowledge comes entirely from books rather than first-hand observation." A servant appeared with a tray of champagne, and the Duke took 2 glasses, offering one to Jane. She accepted it with murmured thanks, acutely aware of the attention their conversation had attracted. "Books are trustworthy companions," he said, "though they sometimes romanticize the discomforts of archaeological excavation. The heat, the insects, the tedium of careful documentation, these rarely make their way into published accounts." Jane smiled despite herself. "I imagine not, Your Grace." Just as the tedium of London drawing-rooms rarely features in romantic novels. His laugh was unexpected, a rich, genuine sound that transformed his austere features. "Touché, Miss Kensington. I'd forgotten how refreshingly direct English conversation can be after years of diplomatic niceties in foreign courts." From across the room, Jane caught her mother's wide-eyed stare of disbelief, followed by a frantic gesture urging her to continue the conversation. She felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "I should not keep you, Your Grace. I'm sure Lady Pembroke has many guests eager for your attention." "Indeed she does," he agreed, glancing around the room with barely concealed reluctance. "Though few, I suspect, who would recognize Homer, let alone critique his representation." Before Jane could respond, Lady Pembroke appeared at his elbow. "Vincent, darling, you simply must meet the Countess of Warrington. She's been excavating Etruscan ruins on her Italian estate." She nodded dismissively at Jane. "Thank you for entertaining His Grace, Miss Kensington." Jane watched as he was led away, feeling the familiar invisibility descend once more. For one brief moment, she had been seen, not as a plain, unmarriageable burden, but as a person with thoughts and opinions worth hearing. The remainder of the evening passed slowly. Jane observed from her corner as the Duke moved through the room, his tall figure always at the center of an admiring group. Occasionally, she thought she felt his gaze in her direction, but dismissed it as wishful thinking. As the carriage bore them home later that night, her mother was unusually quiet, glancing at Jane with speculative eyes. "The Duke spoke to you," she finally said. "What did you discuss?" Jane stared out at the gaslit streets. Classical sculpture, nothing of consequence. He laughed, I heard him laugh. Her mother's voice held wonder. Vincent Queensberry is not known for his mirth, particularly in the company of unmarried ladies. Please, mother, Jane sighed. Don't construct fantasies. He was merely being polite to someone who recognized his scholarly interests. But later, alone in her bedroom, Jane allowed herself a moment of remembered pleasure. For a few brief minutes, she had conversed as an equal with one of England's most brilliant minds. It would never happen again, of course. Men like the Duke did not notice women like her, except perhaps as a momentary curiosity, a bluestocking who could discuss Homer rather than the latest fashions. She placed Professor Hugh's gift on her nightstand and prepared for bed, extinguishing the candle with a decisive puff. Tomorrow would be another day of invisibility, of polite dismissals, of being too plain for marriage, as society had long since determined. She could not know that the Duke of Queensberry had inquired about her as he departed Lady Pembroke's salon, nor that his carriage was at that very moment passing through Mayfair, the occupant gazing thoughtfully at the darkened windows of London's fashionable homes, remembering a pair of uncommonly intelligent hazel eyes. The following week brought unseasonably fine weather to London, coaxing fashionable society into the parks and promenades earlier than usual. For the Kensington household, it meant an exhausting round of morning calls, afternoon walks, and evening entertainments, all in service of securing Elizabeth's future through an advantageous match. Jane accompanied her mother and sister dutifully, bearing the inevitable comparisons between Elizabeth's golden beauty and her own plain appearance with practiced stoicism. At 19, she had still believed that her intelligence and conversation might compensate for her lack of beauty or fortune. At 25, she knew better. Hold the parasol higher, Jane, her mother instructed as they strolled through Hyde Park on Thursday afternoon. Elizabeth's complexion must be protected at all costs. Jane adjusted the frilly confection, carefully angling it to shield her sister from the spring sunshine. Elizabeth, resplendent in pale blue muslin that matched her eyes, was attracting admiring glances from every gentleman they passed. Lord Hartington is watching again, Elizabeth whispered, affecting not to notice the young Viscount who had indeed slowed his horse to a walk beside the path. Do you think he might call tomorrow? If he has any sense, he will, their mother replied. Mind your posture, dear. A gentleman appreciates a lady who carries herself with dignity. Jane bit her tongue to keep from pointing out that most gentlemen appreciated a lady who carried a substantial dowry far more than her posture. The Kensington family's finances had deteriorated to the point where Elizabeth's dowry would be minimal, a fact their mother concealed with increasingly desperate creativity. They had completed one circuit of the fashionable path when a stir of excitement rippled through the crowd. Jane looked up to see the cause. A magnificent black stallion had entered the park, its rider commanding immediate attention. The Duke of Queensberry sat his mount with the easy grace of a man who had spent much of his life on horseback. He wore no fashionable top hat, but instead a wide-brimmed hat that spoke of practical concerns rather than London fashion. His riding clothes were impeccably tailored but suggested function over ornament. "Oh my," breathed Elizabeth, "is that truly the Duke? He's far more handsome than rumour suggested." Their mother straightened, adjusting her bonnet. "Indeed it is. They say he's finally seeking a duchess after all these years. Every eligible lady in London will be setting her cap for him." Jane kept her gaze fixed on the gravel path. The Duke had undoubtedly forgotten their brief exchange at Lady Pembroke's salon, and she had no desire to appear as though she were pursuing his attention like every other marriage-minded female in the park. Fate, however, had other plans. The Duke had spotted their small party and was guiding his horse in their direction. "Mrs. Kensington," he said, tipping his hat as he reined in beside them. "Miss Kensington." His gaze found Jane's with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "And this must be your younger daughter." Jane stared in astonishment. Not only had he remembered her, but he had taken the trouble to learn her mother's name. Her mother recovered quickly from her surprise. "Your Grace, how kind of you to stop. May I present my youngest daughter, Miss Elizabeth Kensington. Elizabeth, His Grace, the Duke of Queensberry." Elizabeth executed a perfect curtsy, her face tilted at the precise angle to showcase her delicate profile. "An honor, Your Grace." The Duke acknowledged the introduction with a polite nod before returning his attention to Jane. "I've just come from the British Museum. Professor Hughes mentioned you share an interest in the new Egyptian acquisitions." "Ah, yes," Jane stammered, bewildered by his attention. "Though I've not had the opportunity to view them myself." A situation easily remedied. "I'm conducting a private viewing for a few interested scholars next Wednesday afternoon. Professor Hughes will be attending. Perhaps you would care to join us." Jane was aware of her mother's astonished intake of breath, of Elizabeth's wide-eyed stare, of the curious glances from passers-by. "That's very kind, Your Grace, but—" "Jane would be delighted," her mother interjected, gripping Jane's arm with warning pressure. "What an exceptional opportunity." The Duke's gaze remained on Jane's face, awaiting her personal response. It was this, more than anything, that decided her. He was offering the invitation to her, not to her family name or connections, but to her mind. "Thank you," she said simply. "I would be honored." He inclined his head. "Excellent, 1 o'clock then. I'll send a carriage." He tipped his hat once more. "Mrs. Kensington, Miss Elizabeth, good day." They watched in silence as he rode away, his straight back and proud bearing distinguishing him among the fashionable crowd. "Jane," her mother whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed excitement, "what on earth have you done to attract his attention?" "Nothing, mother. We merely discussed classical art at Lady Pembroke's salon." Elizabeth was staring at her with newfound curiosity. "But why would he invite you to the museum? And to send his own carriage, it's most unusual." Jane had no answer. The Duke's interest was as mystifying to her as it was to her family. Men of his stature did not cultivate acquaintances with plain, dowerless spinsters unless they had ulterior motives. Yet what possible motive could the Duke of Queensberry have? Their walk home was filled with her mother's increasingly elaborate speculations. By the time they reached Manchester Square, the Duke's invitation had transformed from a scholarly outing to the prelude of a grand romance. "We must have Madame Lucille alter your blue silk immediately," her mother declared as they entered the house. "And your hair, perhaps we should attempt those new ringlets that Lady Winchester's daughter wore at the Simmons ball." "Mother, please," Jane protested. "It's a museum visit, not a proposal of marriage, and I'm perfectly capable of selecting my own attire." But her mother was already dispatching a footman to Madame Lucille's shop with an urgent summons, her face alight with the first real hope she'd shown regarding Jane's prospects in years. Later that evening, Jane sat at her dressing table, brushing her hair with methodical strokes. The looking-glass reflected her unchanged features, the same unremarkable face that had failed to secure a husband for 7 consecutive seasons. "Why would he notice me?" she whispered to her reflection. "What could he possibly see that everyone else has overlooked?" The glass offered no answers, only the truth she had long since accepted. She was Jane Kensington, too plain for marriage, too intelligent for comfort, too poor for consequence. One afternoon in the Duke's company would not change that fundamental reality. Yet as she extinguished her candle and lay in the darkness, Jane allowed herself a dangerous luxury: hope. Not hope for marriage or position, but for a few hours of conversation with a man who seemed to value her mind. In a world that had reduced her worth to her appearance and marriageability, such recognition was more precious than any courtship could be. She fell asleep with the ghost of a smile on her lips, dreaming not of wedding veils or ducal coronets, but of ancient artifacts and the unexpected pleasure of being truly seen. The following week passed in a flurry of preparations that Jane found both touching and mortifying. Her mother ordered new gloves, had Jane's second-best day dress altered and trimmed with fresh ribbon, and even purchased a small bottle of French perfume, an extravagance that made Jane wince, knowing the family's precarious finances. "It's an investment," her mother insisted when Jane protested the expense. "The Duke has shown interest. We must capitalize on it." "He's shown interest in my opinion on Egyptian artifacts," Jane corrected, "not in me as a potential bride." But her practical objections fell on deaf ears. Even Elizabeth had caught the fever of excitement, offering Jane her prized pearl earrings for the museum visit. By Wednesday morning, Jane's nerves were frayed from the constant attention. She had spent her evenings reading everything available about the museum's Egyptian collection, determined not to appear ignorant if the Duke engaged her in scholarly conversation. At precisely 12:30, a sleek black carriage bearing the Queensberry crest arrived at their door. Jane descended the stairs in her refreshed blue dress, her hair arranged simply but neatly beneath a modest bonnet. "Remember your deportment," her mother whispered, adjusting Jane's shawl one last time. "And do try to smile, dear. Your serious expression makes you look severe." Jane forced a smile that felt more like a grimace. "I'm visiting a museum, Mother, not performing at court." The footman handed her into the carriage with formal courtesy. To her surprise, the vehicle was empty. She had half expected the Duke to accompany her. Instead, she found herself alone with her thoughts as the carriage rolled through London's busy streets. The British Museum loomed impressive and stately, its columned portico reminiscent of the ancient temples it sought to preserve and celebrate. Jane had visited twice before, both times on public days, when crowds made careful examination of the exhibits nearly impossible. Today, a liveried footman waited at the entrance to escort her inside. "Miss Kensington," he said with a bow, "His Grace is expecting you in the Egyptian gallery." She followed him through the grand entrance hall, past marble statues and glass cases filled with antiquities from around the world. The museum was quiet, with only a few scattered visitors examining the collections. Jane felt her nervousness giving way to anticipation. Regardless of the Duke's motives for inviting her, this was a rare opportunity to view treasures from the ancient world in peace. The Egyptian gallery was dimly lit to protect the artifacts, creating an atmosphere of hushed reverence. Jane spotted the Duke immediately, his tall figure bent in conversation with Professor Hughes and two other scholarly-looking gentlemen near a display of funerary objects. He looked up as she approached, and Jane was startled by the genuine pleasure that transformed his austere features. "Miss Kensington," he said, coming forward to greet her. "I'm delighted you could join us." "Thank you for the invitation, Your Grace," she replied, cursing with appropriate formality. "You know Professor Hughes, of course. Allow me to introduce Professor Campbell of Oxford and Dr. Reynolds of the Archaeological Society." Jane exchanged greetings with the gentlemen, noting their curious glances. Clearly, they were as puzzled by her presence as she was herself. "Miss Kensington has a remarkable grasp of classical history," the Duke explained, as if sensing their confusion. "I believe she'll find our recent acquisitions of particular interest." Professor Hughes beamed at Jane with grandfatherly approval. "I've had the pleasure of discussing Herodotus with Miss Kensington. Her insights are most refreshing." Thus validated, Jane felt herself relax slightly as the Duke led the small party deeper into the gallery. He moved with the confident ease of a man accustomed to these surroundings, occasionally gesturing toward particular artifacts as he explained their provenance. "This collection represents 3 years of excavation," he told them, pausing before a display of intricately carved amulets. "Some pieces date to the 18th dynasty, approximately 1550 to 1295 BCE. Jane leaned closer to examine a scarab beetle carved from lapis lazuli. "The workmanship is extraordinary." "Indeed," the Duke's voice held approval. "The ancient Egyptians believed scarabs possessed magical properties, specifically the ability to transform death into rebirth." "Like Khepri, the god who pushed the sun across the sky," Jane said without thinking, then colored slightly at her presumption. The Duke's eyebrows rose. "Precisely. You've studied Egyptian mythology, Miss Kensington." "Only what I've gleaned from translations and museum guidebooks, Your Grace. I've never had formal instruction." "Self-education often produces the most passionate scholars," Professor Campbell interjected kindly. "Those who pursue knowledge for its own sake rather than academic advancement." The Duke guided them to the next display, a collection of papyrus fragments protected beneath glass. These texts describe funerary rituals for nobility. The translation is ongoing, but we've identified references to Osiris and the weighing of the heart ceremony. For the next hour, Jane found herself absorbed in the exhibits, forgetting her nervousness as she asked questions and offered observations. The Duke answered with surprising patience, treating her inquiries with the same seriousness he afforded his male colleagues. The scholars eventually drifted toward a collection of canopic jars, leaving Jane momentarily alone with the Duke before an imposing sarcophagus. "You've surprised me, Miss Kensington," he said quietly. She glanced up, uncertain whether to be pleased or offended. "In what way, Your Grace?" "Your knowledge exceeds what one might expect from casual reading. You've clearly dedicated considerable time to these studies." Jane hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Books have been my companions when society proved less welcoming." Something flickered in his grey eyes, understanding, perhaps. The pursuit of knowledge is rarely valued in drawing rooms, particularly in young ladies. Or in spinsters approaching their 26th birthday, she added with a wry smile. The Duke studied her face for a moment. "Age brings perspective, Miss Kensington. I found my fourth decade far more enlightening than my third." "Is that why you spent so many years abroad, in pursuit of perspective?" The question was too personal, and Jane regretted it immediately. To her surprise, the Duke merely smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of his lips. Partly, though escaping the matchmaking manners of London provided additional motivation. Jane couldn't help but laugh. "I can imagine. 7 seasons taught me the desperation that accompanies the marriage mart." 7 seasons, his brow furrowed. "Surely you haven't been subjected to that particular form of torture for so long." "I'm afraid so, Your Grace. Though I've now been granted the dubious mercy of attending primarily as my sister's chaperone rather than as a participant." Before he could respond, Professor Hughes approached with evident excitement. "Queensberry, you simply must show Miss Kensington the new papyrus from Thebes. The hieroglyphics describing the female pharaoh would be of particular interest to a lady of intellect." The Duke inclined his head. "An excellent suggestion. This way, Miss Kensington." As they moved through the gallery, Jane became aware of curious glances from other museum visitors who had begun to filter into the exhibition. The Duke of Queensberry escorting a nondescript young woman was clearly a subject of speculation. He seemed oblivious to the attention, focusing entirely on the artifacts and their historical significance. Jane found herself responding to his evident passion for archaeology, asking questions that revealed her own keen interest in the subject. "The female pharaoh Hatshepsut ruled as king for over 20 years, he explained as they examined the fragile papyrus. "She wore the ceremonial beard and male regalia, insisting on being addressed with masculine titles." "How remarkable," Jane murmured, studying the ancient script. "To defy convention so completely and successfully." "Until her successor attempted to erase her from history," the Duke noted. "Many of her monuments were defaced, her name struck from records. Yet here she is, still remembered thousands of years later." Jane glanced up at him. "Perhaps that's the true victory, to leave a mark that outlasts those who would erase you." Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a moment of surprise followed by what appeared to be re-evaluation. "A profound observation, Miss Kensington." The afternoon passed more quickly than Jane could have imagined. By the time the museum staff began discreetly indicating that closing time approached, she felt as though she had traveled through centuries of history in the Duke's company. "I must thank you, Your Grace," she said as they walked toward the entrance. "This has been a most illuminating experience." "The pleasure was mine," he replied, surprising her with his sincerity. "It's refreshing to share these treasures with someone who appreciates them beyond their exotic appeal." The Duke's carriage waited outside, its gleaming black surface reflecting the late afternoon sunlight. Jane prepared to thank him once more and take her leave, assuming a hackney would be her mode of transport home. "My carriage will return you to Manchester Square," he said, forestalling her farewell. "Unless you have another engagement this evening." "No, thank you, that's most kind." He handed her into the vehicle himself, rather than leaving the task to a footman, a courtesy that sent a ripple of whispers through the small crowd gathered on the museum steps. "Miss Kensington," he said, still holding her gloved hand, "would you permit me to call on you tomorrow? There are several volumes in my library on Egyptian burial practices that might interest you." Jane stared at him in astonishment. A museum visit was one thing, a public setting with educational purpose. A personal call at her home was quite another matter, one with social implications that would set London tongues wagging. "Your Grace," she hesitated, torn between propriety and the genuine desire to continue their conversations. "That would be acceptable, though I fear you'll find our library sadly lacking compared to your own." "I come for the conversation, not the setting." His voice held a note of amusement. "Until tomorrow, then." He closed the carriage door and stepped back. As the vehicle pulled away, Jane caught a glimpse of his tall figure still watching from the museum steps, a thoughtful expression on his face. She leaned back against the leather seat, her mind whirling with questions. Why had one of England's most eligible bachelors, a man known for avoiding society and its matrimonial schemes, chosen to seek out her company? What could he possibly want from plain Jane Kensington? The carriage turned onto Oxford Street, and Jane closed her eyes, allowing herself to remember the afternoon, not as the bewildering social anomaly it was, but as the intellectual pleasure it had been. Whatever the Duke's motives, she had experienced a few precious hours of being valued for her mind rather than dismissed for her appearance. That alone was worth whatever gossip might follow. By the time Jane reached home, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across Manchester Square. She expected to find her mother and sister eagerly awaiting her return, but the house was oddly quiet as the footman admitted her. "Where is everyone, Phillips?" she asked, surrendering her bonnet and gloves. The servant's expression was carefully neutral. "Mrs. Kensington and Miss Elizabeth are in the drawing room, miss, with Lady Harrington." Jane's steps faltered. Lady Harrington, the most notorious gossip in London, was paying a call. The coincidence seemed too great. She paused outside the drawing room, hearing the murmur of voices within. Taking a steadying breath, she entered to find her mother and sister seated with their unexpected guest, the remains of tea service on the table between them. "Jane," her mother's voice was unnaturally bright, "how fortunate you've returned. Lady Harrington has honoured us with a visit." The elderly woman turned, her sharp eyes assessing Jane with undisguised curiosity. At 72, Lady Harrington had outlived 3 husbands and terrorized London society for half a century with her acid tongue and encyclopedic knowledge of every family scandals. "Miss Kensington," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth, "how delightful to see you again. I was just telling your mother what a stir you caused at the British Museum today." Jane curtsied politely. "Good afternoon, Lady Harrington. I wasn't aware my museum visit warranted attention." The old woman's smile sharpened. "My dear, when a confirmed bachelor like Vincent Queensberry personally escorts a young lady through an exhibition and is observed in animated conversation with her for over 2 hours, it naturally excites comment." Jane felt heat rising to her cheeks. Of course Lady Harrington would have informants at the museum. She probably maintained a network of spies throughout London, reporting on the comings and goings of the ton. "His Grace kindly included me in a scholarly viewing of Egyptian artifacts," Jane said carefully. Professor Hughes and several other academics were present. "Indeed," Lady Harrington's eyebrows rose. "How fascinating that the Duke's carriage delivered you to the museum and returned you home. Such courtesy is rarely extended to scholarly viewings." Jane's mother intervened, refilling Lady Harrington's teacup. "The Duke has expressed interest in Jane's historical knowledge. It's a shared intellectual pursuit, nothing more." The old woman's laugh was like dry leaves rustling. "My dear Alina, a duke does not share intellectual pursuits with unmarried young ladies unless he has ulterior motives. Particularly not Vincent Queensberry, who has avoided eligible females as though they carried the plague since that unfortunate business with Lady Caroline Wexford years ago." Jane sat down, her legs suddenly unsteady. "What unfortunate business?" "You wouldn't remember, you were still in the schoolroom. Lady Caroline was the season's incomparable, and everyone expected an announcement." Then suddenly, the Duke left for Greece without explanation, and Caroline married Lord Pembroke within the month. Lady Harrington sipped her tea. There were rumours, of course. There always are, Jane said dryly. Lady Harrington's eyes gleamed with appreciation for the retort. Quite so. But unlike most rumours, these contained a kernel of truth. I happened to be acquainted with Caroline's lady's maid, who overheard a most illuminating conversation between her mistress and Lord Pembroke before the Duke's departure. Despite herself, Jane leaned forward slightly. Lady Harrington noted the movement with satisfaction. It seems our esteemed Duke discovered that Lady Caroline's interest lay more in his title than his person. She was overheard laughing about his scholarly pursuits, calling him hopelessly tedious, and suggesting marriage to him would be a sacrifice worth making for a duchess's coronet. Elizabeth gasped. How cruel! Indeed, particularly as Lord Pembroke was apparently her true preference, though his mere baronetcy made him an inferior matrimonial prospect. Lady Harrington set down her cup with a decisive click. The Duke left England within a week, and society has speculated ever since that he will never risk such humiliation again. Jane absorbed this information silently. It explained much about the Duke's reputation for avoiding society and its marriage-minded daughters. A man of his intelligence and sensitivity would not easily recover from such a betrayal of trust. Which makes his attention to you all the more intriguing, Miss Kensington, Lady Harrington continued, her gaze sharp. He must find something quite extraordinary in your conversation to risk London's speculation again. The implication was clear. What could the Duke possibly see in plain Jane Kensington that would warrant such a risk? I'm sure His Grace is merely being kind, Jane replied, refusing to show how deeply the unspoken question strung. His knowledge of Egyptian antiquities is unparalleled, and he generously shares it with those who show genuine interest. Perhaps, Lady Harrington conceded, though her tone suggested deep skepticism. In any case, you should know that your name will be linked with his in tomorrow's gossip. The question on everyone's lips will be whether the Duke of Queensberry has finally decided to seek a duchess, and if so, why he has chosen such an unexpected candidate. Jane's mother stiffened at the barely veiled insult. My daughter comes from one of England's oldest families, Lady Harrington. The Kensingtons were granted lands by William the Conqueror. Ancient lineage is all very well, my dear, but we all know it takes more than that to secure a duke in these modern times. Lady Harrington rose, gathering her shawl. Still, stranger things have happened, and Queensberry always was unconventional. After she had departed in a rustle of expensive silk and lingering perfume, Jane's mother collapsed back onto the sofa. That horrible woman. Coming here to assess you like a horse at Tattersall's. She came to gather information, mother, Jane said wearily. Tomorrow, every drawing room in London will hear her version of today's events. Elizabeth, who had remained uncharacteristically silent during the visit, finally spoke. Is it true, Jane? Will the Duke call here tomorrow? He mentioned bringing some books on Egyptian antiquities, Jane admitted, but please don't attach any significance to it. His interest is scholarly, nothing more. Her mother and sister exchanged glances of barely suppressed excitement. We must have the drawing room thoroughly cleaned, her mother declared, and Phillips must wear his best livery. Elizabeth, you'll need to practice that new pianoforte piece. The Duke might wish to be entertained. Mother, please, Jane protested. This isn't a formal society call. He's bringing books, not a proposal of marriage. But her objections were futile. By dinner, the entire household was in a state of barely controlled frenzy. The best silver was brought out for polishing, the drawing-room curtains were taken down for washing, and even the ancient Persian carpet was beaten within an inch of its life. Jane escaped to her bedroom as soon as she could, seeking refuge from the chaos. Seated at her small writing desk, she opened her journal and attempted to record the day's events objectively. Instead, she found herself sketching the sarcophagus they had examined, trying to capture its intricate carvings from memory. Beside it, almost unconsciously, she began to outline a tall figure with broad shoulders and an intent expression. Realizing what she was doing, Jane hastily closed the journal. This was madness. The Duke's interest was intellectual, perhaps even charitable, taking pity on a blue-stocking spinster who would otherwise never have access to such rarefied knowledge. Yet as she prepared for bed, Jane could not entirely suppress the treacherous hope that had begun to take root. Not hope for marriage, she was too practical for such fantasies, but for friendship, for conversation. For the respect of a man who seemed to value substance over appearance. She extinguished her candle and lay in the darkness, Lady Harrington's words echoing in her mind. The question on everyone's lips will be whether the Duke has finally decided to seek a duchess, and if so, why he has chosen such an unexpected candidate. Jane pulled the coverlet more tightly around her shoulders, as if it could shield her from the whispers that would surely follow her now. She had spent years cultivating invisibility, accepting her role as the plain, overlooked Kensington daughter. The Duke's attention had suddenly thrust her into a spotlight she had never sought and was ill-prepared to face. Whatever his motives, Vincent Queensberry had inadvertently placed Jane at the centre of London's most vicious social arena. And if his interest proved fleeting, as it almost certainly would, she would be left more exposed and vulnerable than ever before. Vincent Queensberry stood at the window of his library, watching dawn break over Grosvenor Square. He had been awake for hours, his mind turning over the events of the previous day with uncharacteristic restlessness. Miss Jane Kensington. She had surprised him, first with her knowledge, then with her perceptiveness, and finally with her complete lack of artifice. In a world of carefully calculated social maneuvers, her straightforward manner was as refreshing as it was rare. "Your Grace," his butler intoned from the doorway, "Mr. Reynolds has arrived as requested." Vincent turned from the window. "Show him in, Harrison." James Reynolds, his solicitor and one of his oldest friends, entered moments later. Despite the early hour, he was impeccably dressed, his expression betraying only mild curiosity at the urgent summons. "You're about early, Queensberry," he remarked, accepting the chair Vincent indicated. "I take it this isn't a social call." "I need information," Vincent said, pouring coffee for them both. "About the Kensington family of Manchester Square." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "The late Sir William Kensington's family, what's your interest in them?" "Professional curiosity," Vincent replied, knowing his friend would see through the evasion. "Of course," Reynolds said dryly. "You regularly summon me at dawn to satisfy professional curiosity about respectable but financially straitened families with unmarried daughters." Vincent ignored the implied question. "What do you know of them?" Reynolds sipped his coffee, considering. Sir William was well respected, served briefly in Parliament, inherited substantial estates in Hertfordshire. When he died 8 or 9 years ago, it emerged that his investments had suffered significant losses. The widow, Lady Elena, retained the Manchester Square property, but little else of value. "And the daughters?" "3, I believe. The eldest married Baron Ashford last season, a May-December arrangement that raised eyebrows but secured her future. The youngest is just out, or nearly so." Reynolds paused, studying Vincent's face. "And the middle daughter, Miss Jane Kensington, has been on the marriage mart for several years without success." Vincent kept his expression neutral. "Why without success?" "The usual reasons: limited dowry, no particularly influential connections, and," Reynolds hesitated, "and," Vincent prompted, "she's considered unremarkable. Not a beauty, not accomplished in the conventional sense. There was a flurry of interest when she first came out, due to the family name, but it quickly subsided when more dazzling prospects appeared." Reynolds set down his cup. "Why this sudden interest in Miss Kensington?" Vincent moved back to the window, avoiding his friend's perceptive gaze. "I encountered her at the British Museum yesterday. Her knowledge of Egyptian antiquities was impressive for someone without formal education." "Ah," Reynolds said, a wealth of understanding in the single syllable. "And did this scholarly young lady also happen to be refreshingly unimpressed by your title and fortune?" Vincent's mouth twitched. "She seemed more interested in burial customs of the 18th dynasty than in my ducal status, if that's what you're asking." "After Lady Caroline, I can see the appeal." Reynolds rose, straightening his waistcoat. "Just be careful, Vincent. London society is watching your every move, particularly where unmarried ladies are concerned. If you show marked attention to Miss Kensington without honourable intentions, you'll damage her standing, limited though it may be." The warning was gentle but clear. Vincent acknowledged it with a nod. "I've invited her to view my collection of papyri, a scholarly interest, nothing more." "If you say so." Reynolds collected his hat and gloves. "Though I feel compelled to point out that you've never before invited a young, unmarried lady to view your papyri." After his friend departed, Vincent remained by the window, considering. Reynolds was right. His attention to Miss Kensington would inevitably spark gossip. The Ton had little else to occupy them besides speculation about potential matches, particularly those involving wealthy bachelors. Yet something about Jane Kensington had captured his interest in a way no woman had in years. Not her appearance, though he found her expressive eyes and unaffected manner more appealing than the practiced beauty of society debutantes. Not her family connections, which were respectable but hardly exceptional. It was her mind, keen, curious, and unfettered by the rigid constraints of female education. Vincent moved to his desk, where several leather-bound volumes on Egyptian antiquities lay ready for his visit to Manchester Square. His finger traced the embossed hieroglyphics on one cover, remembering the genuine fascination in Miss Kensington's eyes as she examined similar symbols at the museum. For years, he had avoided London's marriage mart, focusing instead on his archaeological pursuits. The humiliation of discovering Lady Caroline's true feelings, her mockery of his scholarly interests, her naked ambition for his title, had left a wound that time had scarred but never fully healed. Now, approaching his 40th year, Vincent found himself increasingly aware of his duty to provide an heir. The Queensberry title had passed unbroken through 16 generations. He could not be the one to let it end, regardless of his personal reluctance to enter the matrimonial state. Miss Kensington was of good family, intelligent, and appeared to share his intellectual pursuits. She was also, if Reynolds's assessment was accurate, unlikely to have other serious suitors. A practical arrangement might be possible, a marriage of companionship rather than passion, with clearly defined expectations on both sides. The idea took shape in his mind, appealing to his logical nature. He would cultivate her acquaintance, assess her suitability as a duchess, and if she met his requirements, make her an offer that would benefit them both. No romantic nonsense, no vulnerability to betrayal, simply a rational contract between compatible individuals. Satisfied with this plan, Vincent instructed his valet to prepare his most conservative morning attire. His call at Manchester Square would inevitably attract notice, but he would ensure his conduct was impeccable. Miss Kensington deserved that courtesy, at least. As his carriage rolled through Mayfair later that morning, Vincent found himself anticipating the visit with unexpected eagerness. Whatever came of his practical scheme, he genuinely looked forward to continuing their conversation about ancient Egypt. It had been too long since he had encountered a mind that engaged with his own on subjects close to his heart. The Kensington residence, when his carriage drew up before it, proved to be a modest townhouse showing signs of genteel neglect. The curtains in the front windows appeared freshly washed but faded, the brass knocker gleamed with recent polishing, and the steps had been scrubbed clean. Everything spoke of determined respectability, maintained despite limited resources. A middle-aged butler admitted him with formal courtesy, taking his hat and gloves before leading him to a drawing room where Mrs. Kensington waited with her 2 daughters. "Your Grace," the matron said, rising to curtsy deeply, "what an honor to welcome you to our home." Vincent bowed. "Mrs. Kensington, Miss Kensington, Miss Elizabeth, I trust I find you well this morning." His gaze went immediately to Jane, noting how she hung back slightly while her mother and sister moved forward with eager smiles. She wore a simple morning dress of pale green that complemented her hazel eyes, her brown hair arranged without elaborate curls or ornaments. Compared to her sister's golden beauty, she was indeed unremarkable by society's standards, yet Vincent found his attention drawn to her composed features and direct gaze. "We are very well, Your Grace," Mrs. Kensington gushed, "and so grateful for your interest in Jane's scholarly pursuits. It's not every day a duke takes notice of a young lady's intellectual achievements." Jane's cheeks coloured slightly. "Mother, His Grace has kindly brought books on Egyptian antiquities, not come to praise my meagre knowledge." Vincent produced the volumes he had selected. "Hardly meagre, Miss Kensington. Your observations yesterday revealed a depth of understanding rare in those without formal training." He handed her the books, noting how her fingers caressed the leather bindings with genuine appreciation. "These are extraordinary," she murmured, opening the top volume to reveal hand-colored plates depicting temple murals. "Belzoni's excavations at Abu Simbel." "Indeed." "This is his personal copy, with margin notes not included in the published edition." Mrs. Kensington cleared her throat. "How fascinating. Elizabeth, perhaps you might pour tea for His Grace. And then favour us with that lovely new piece you've been practicing." The younger Miss Kensington, a strikingly pretty girl of perhaps 18, dimpled at Vincent. "I should be delighted if His Grace enjoys music." "Another time, perhaps," Vincent said politely. "I've come specifically to discuss these volumes with Miss Kensington, and my time is regrettably limited this morning." The disappointment on both mother and younger daughter's faces was comically evident. Jane, however, appeared relieved as she led him to a small table near the window where they might examine the books together. "I apologize for my family's transparency, Your Grace," she said quietly as they seated themselves. "Your visit has caused quite a stir in our household." "No apology necessary," he assured her. "And please, when we are discussing scholarly matters, I prefer Lord Queensberry to Your Grace. The latter makes me feel like a cathedral." That unexpected touch of humour earned him a genuine smile, transforming her face in a way that caught him off guard. When Jane Kensington smiled, she was not merely unremarkable. There was a luminosity to her expression that transcended conventional beauty. "Very well, Lord Queensberry," she said, turning her attention to the books. "These illustrations are extraordinary. The colours seem so vivid, considering their age." For the next half-hour, they pored over the volumes together, heads bent close over the pages, as Vincent explained the significance of various hieroglyphics, and Jane asked increasingly perceptive questions. He found himself impressed by her quick understanding and her ability to connect disparate pieces of information into coherent patterns. Occasionally, he glanced up to find Mrs. Kensington and Elizabeth watching them with barely concealed anticipation, as though expecting him to drop to one knee at any moment. Jane seemed oblivious to their scrutiny, entirely absorbed in the scholarly discussion. "This symbol appears repeatedly," she noted, pointing to a particular hieroglyph. "Is it a name?" "The cartouche of Ramses II," Vincent confirmed, "one of Egypt's most prolific builders and self-promoters. He ordered his name carved on monuments built by his predecessors, effectively claiming their achievements as his own." "How very like certain members of Parliament," Jane remarked dryly. Vincent laughed, earning startled glances from her mother and sister. "A apt comparison, Miss Kensington. Politics, it seems, has changed little in 3,000 years." As their conversation continued, Vincent became increasingly aware of how comfortable he felt in Jane's company. Unlike most unmarried ladies of his acquaintance, she made no obvious effort to impress or flatter him. Her questions were genuine, her observations thoughtful, and her occasional flashes of wit refreshingly unforced. When the mantel clock chimed 11, Vincent reluctantly closed the volume they had been examining. "I fear I must take my leave. I have an appointment with the Archaeological Society at noon." "Of course," Jane said, a touch of regret in her voice. "Thank you for sharing these remarkable books. I shall return them with the greatest care." "Keep them as long as you wish," he told her, rising from his chair. "My library has many duplicates." Mrs. Kensington stepped forward, her expression hopeful. "Your Grace has been most kind. Perhaps you would consider joining us for dinner one evening next week, a small gathering, just family and one or two close friends." Vincent recognized the invitation for what it was, an attempt to further the acquaintance in a more intimate setting. Normally, he would have declined such an obvious matrimonial trap. Today, however, it aligned perfectly with his own plans. "I would be delighted," he said, noting Jane's look of surprise. "Would Thursday be convenient?" Perfectly, Mrs. Kensington could hardly contain her excitement. We dine at 7, though of course we can adjust to suit your Grace's schedule. 7 will be fine. Vincent turned to Jane, who was watching him with a mixture of confusion and wariness. Until Thursday then, Miss Kensington. I look forward to continuing our discussion. As his carriage carried him away from Manchester Square, Vincent reflected on the visit with satisfaction. Miss Jane Kensington had proven even more intelligent and congenial than he had hoped. Their shared interest in antiquities provided a natural foundation for further acquaintance, and her lack of pretension was genuinely refreshing after years of navigating society's artificial conventions. Yes, his plan was proceeding well. A few more meetings would confirm whether she possessed the qualities necessary in a duchess, and then he could present his proposal, a rational arrangement based on mutual respect and compatible interests. It did not occur to Vincent that Jane might have plans or expectations of her own, nor that his carefully controlled approach to matrimony might be vulnerable to forces beyond his logical calculation. The Duke of Queensberry had spent a lifetime mastering his emotions, analyzing every situation with scholarly detachment. He had no reason to believe this particular project would be any different. "The Duke of Queensberry is coming to dinner." Elizabeth's voice rose to a near shriek as the front door closed behind their distinguished visitor. "Here, on Thursday. Jane, how on earth did you manage it?" Jane stood by the window, watching the Duke's carriage pull away from their modest townhouse. "I didn't manage anything, Lizzie. His Grace is merely being polite." Polite? Her mother collapsed onto the sofa, fanning herself vigorously. "Jane, dukes do not make morning calls on unremarkable young ladies out of politeness. Nor do they personally deliver rare books, engage in half-hour discussions of Egyptian hieroglyphics, or accept invitations to family dinners." Jane turned from the window, cradling the precious volumes against her chest. "He values intellectual conversation. I happen to show interest in his scholarly pursuits, that is all." "That is most certainly not all," her mother declared. "I've been launching daughters into society for 9 years, Jane. I know when a gentleman shows more than passing interest, and the Duke's attention to you goes well beyond scholarly courtesy." Elizabeth nodded emphatically. "He barely looked at me, your mother. His eyes were fixed on you the entire time, and he laughed at your jest about Parliament. When has a duke ever laughed at your humour before?" "Never," Jane admitted. "But that's because no duke has ever bothered to speak with me at all." Her mother rose from the sofa with sudden energy. "We have precisely 3 days to prepare. The dinner must be perfect, the Sevres china, the best silver, whatever delicacies cook can manage. Elizabeth, your blue silk needs pressing. Jane," she surveyed her middle daughter with critical eyes, "we must do something about your appearance." Jane stiffened. "What exactly is wrong with my appearance?" "Nothing, dear, nothing at all," her mother said hastily. "But for a dinner with a duke, one must make an effort. Perhaps we could arrange your hair in those becoming ringlets Madame Lucille suggested, and your aunt's garnet necklace would add a touch of colour to your complexion." Jane sighed, knowing resistance was futile. For the next 3 days, the Kensington household would be in an uproar of preparation, and she would be subjected to endless suggestions for improving her plain appearance. It was the pattern established through 7 disappointing seasons, the desperate attempt to transform the unmarriageable daughter into something more appealing to potential suitors. "I'll wear whatever you wish, mother," she conceded, already retreating toward the staircase. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to examine these books more carefully." In the sanctuary of her bedroom, Jane placed the Duke's volumes reverently on her writing desk. They represented a small treasure, not only for their rarity and scholarly value, but for the simple fact that they had been selected specifically for her. How long had it been since anyone had considered her interests, her mind, worthy of such attention? She opened the top volume again, running her fingers over the beautifully rendered illustrations of ancient Egyptian temples. The Duke, Lord Queensberry, as he preferred in scholarly discussions, had shared these treasures willingly, treating her questions and observations with genuine respect. For a woman who had spent years being overlooked, such treatment was more intoxicating than any flirtation could be. Jane moved to her window, gazing out at the square below where fashionable carriages rolled past. Somewhere across London, Vincent Queensberry was going about his day, perhaps already forgetting their conversation in the press of more important matters. Yet he had committed to dinner on Thursday, a fact that still left her bewildered. What could he possibly want from her? Lady Harrington's insinuation that he might be seeking a duchess seemed absurd. If the Duke were truly in the market for a wife, every noble family in England would present their daughters for his consideration, beautiful, accomplished young ladies with substantial dowries and impeccable connections. No rational man would choose plain Jane Kensington over such candidates, unless he wanted something other than a conventional society wife, a scholarly companion, perhaps. Someone who shared his intellectual interests rather than his social obligations. Jane shook her head, dismissing the fantasy. Even if the Duke sought an unconventional duchess, there must be dozens of educated, well-born ladies who could fill that role more adequately than she could. No, there must be some other explanation for his attention. Perhaps he merely enjoyed their discussions and saw in her a mind unclouded by matrimonial ambitions. Perhaps he was simply kind, recognizing her isolation and offering friendship to a woman whom society had deemed unworthy of notice. Whatever his motives, Jane resolved to accept his interest at face value, without reading deeper meaning into his actions. She would enjoy their intellectual exchanges for as long as they lasted, storing up these unexpected moments of recognition to sustain her through the inevitable return to invisibility that would follow when he moved on. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. The Kensington household was turned upside down as every room was cleaned, every piece of silver polished, and every menu option debated at exhausting length. Jane submitted to fittings of her best evening gown, endless experiments with her hair, and her mother's increasingly frantic coaching on dinner conversation. "Remember to ask about his estates in Derbyshire, Mrs. Kensington instructed on Wednesday evening. Men enjoy discussing their properties. And do mention how much you admire the restoration work at Westminster Abbey. His grandfather was a principal patron." "Mother, please," Jane protested. "We've already established that the Duke and I can converse perfectly well without rehearsed topics. But you must make an effort to be engaging. Your usual serious demeanor might be acceptable for museum visits, but a dinner requires animation, charm." Jane bit back a retort. Her mother meant well, but her constant reminders of Jane's deficiencies were wearing. If the Duke had shown interest in her at all, it was precisely because she hadn't attempted to charm or dazzle him like every other marriage-minded female in London. By Thursday afternoon, Jane's nerves were frayed from the household tension. She escaped to her room under the pretext of resting before dinner, seeking a few moments of peace before the evening's performance began. Seated at her writing desk, she opened her journal and tried to organize her thoughts. What did she truly know about Vincent Queensberry beyond his title and scholarly reputation? He was intelligent, certainly, observant, possessed of dry humor and unexpected kindness. His manner was reserved but not cold, confident but not arrogant. And his eyes, those penetrating grey eyes that seemed to see beyond surface appearances to something deeper. When he looked at her, Jane felt truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. A dangerous feeling, that. To be noticed after years of invisibility created a vulnerability she had not anticipated. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Jane," Elizabeth's voice called, "Mother says you must begin dressing now. Madame Loussel's girl is here to arrange your hair." Jane closed her journal with a sigh. "I'll be right there." 2 hours later, she stood before her looking-glass, barely recognizing the woman reflected there. Her usually simple hair had been arranged in an intricate style, with soft curls framing her face. Her aunt's garnet necklace glowed warmly against her skin, complementing her best evening gown of deep burgundy silk. The modiste had made last-minute alterations to the bodice, giving it a more fashionable line that flattered Jane's figure more than she had thought possible. "Oh, Jane," Elizabeth breathed from the doorway, "you look beautiful." Jane turned in surprise. Hardly that, but presentable, perhaps. More than presentable, her sister approached, adjusting one of Jane's curls. The Duke won't be able to take his eyes off you. Don't be ridiculous, Lizzie. You're the beauty of the family, not I. Elizabeth smiled, a hint of new maturity in her expression. Beauty isn't everything, you know. The way His Grace looked at you when you were discussing those musty old books. I've never had a gentleman look at me that way. With scholarly interest, Jane teased. With respect, Elizabeth corrected. As though your thoughts mattered more than your appearance. Before Jane could respond to this unexpected insight, their mother appeared, resplendent in her best evening gown and the pearls that were all that remained of her once substantial jewellery collection. Girls. The Duke's carriage has been spotted turning into the square. Places, everyone. They descended to the drawing room where the butler had arranged the furniture to best advantage and lit every candle the household could spare. The room glowed with warm light, disguising the faded upholstery and worn carpet. Remember, Jane, animation, charm, and do ask about Derbyshire, her mother whispered as the sound of carriage wheels announced their guest's arrival. Jane had no time to reply before Phillips was announcing the Duke of Queensberry. He entered with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, his evening attire impeccably tailored to his tall frame. Jane felt her breath catch at the sight of him, not because of his title or position, but because his presence seemed to transform their modest drawing room into something grander. Mrs. Kensington, he said, bowing over her mother's hand. Miss Kensington. His gaze lingered on Jane for a moment, an expression of quiet appreciation in his eyes before he turned to her sister. Miss Elizabeth. Your Grace, we're honoured by your presence, Mrs. Kensington gushed. Please be seated. Phillips will bring refreshments before dinner. The Duke took the offered chair, his posture relaxed but still conveying inherent authority. You have a charming home, Mrs. Kensington. That portrait, is it a Romney? It is indeed, her mother replied, pleased by his recognition of their one remaining valuable artwork. My husband's grandfather, the 4th Baronet. Romney captured his character perfectly. The Kensington determination is quite evident in the jawline. A distinguished lineage, the Duke observed. The Kensingtons fought at Agincourt, did they not? Jane glanced at him in surprise. He had clearly researched their family history before this visit, a courtesy she had not expected. They did, Your Grace, she confirmed, though family legend suggests they were rather more successful at diplomatic negotiations afterward than on the actual battlefield. His mouth quirked in amusement. Honesty about ancestral foibles is refreshing, Miss Kensington. Most families prefer to embellish their historical roles. Jane has always been excessively forthright, her mother said with a nervous laugh. A trait that can be both virtue and liability in society. The Duke's gaze returned to Jane, something like approval warming his eyes. I find candour infinitely preferable to the usual social dissembling. One always knows where one stands with an honest person. The conversation continued through the serving of aperitifs and into dinner, where the Duke proved to be a surprisingly engaged guest. He inquired about Elizabeth's music studies, complimented Mrs. Kensington's choice of wine, and discussed local politics with genuine interest. Yet Jane noticed how his attention consistently returned to her, drawing her into the conversation whenever she fell silent. Have you had opportunity to examine the books I left, Miss Kensington? He asked as the main course was served. Every spare moment, Jane admitted. The hand-coloured illustrations are extraordinary. I was particularly fascinated by the temple dedicated to Hathor at Dendera. Ah, the goddess of love, beauty, music, and motherhood, the Duke said, nodding. The temple contains some of the best-preserved reliefs in Egypt, with colours almost as vibrant as the day they were painted. You've seen them personally, Jane asked, unable to hide her envy. 3 years ago, I spent several months documenting the astronomical ceiling, a remarkable ancient calendar with detailed depictions of the heavens. His expression softened at the memory. I have sketches that might interest you. The published illustrations don't capture the true brilliance of the colours. I would very much like to see them, Jane said, then blushed at her eagerness. Mrs. Kensington interjected smoothly, Your Grace must have found Egypt quite different from your estates in Derbyshire. I understand Queensberry Park is one of the country's most beautiful properties. Jane suppressed a smile at her mother's transparent attempt to introduce the rehearsed topic. The Duke, however, seemed unperturbed by the abrupt change of subject. The contrast is striking, certainly. Egyptian deserts share little in common with Derbyshire's green valleys, though both have their own particular beauty. "Do you spend much time at Queensberry Park, Your Grace?" Elizabeth asked, her pretty face alight with interest. "Not as much as I should, perhaps," he admitted. "My scholarly pursuits have kept me away from England for extended periods, though now that I've returned, I intend to divide my time more equally between London and Derbyshire." "How lovely, Mrs. Kensington said with calculated casualness. "The country air must be a welcome change after your travels, and such a magnificent estate deserves its master's attention." Jane recognized her mother's clumsy attempt to determine whether the Duke was planning to establish a permanent household, information of vital importance to any mother with marriageable daughters. To her surprise, he answered with apparent frankness. "Indeed, at 40, one begins to appreciate the comforts of home more than the excitements of archaeological excavations. My recent travels have satisfied my scholarly curiosity for the moment. I find myself increasingly drawn to the responsibilities I've perhaps neglected these past years." The implication was clear, and Jane saw her mother's eyes widen with fresh hope. The Duke was settling down, embracing his position in society, perhaps even considering his dynastic obligations. He was, in short, finally in the market for a duchess, a fact that made his attention to Jane all the more bewildering. As the meal progressed to dessert, Jane found herself watching him more closely, searching for hidden motives behind his courtesy. He was unfailingly polite to her mother and sister, but his conversation repeatedly circled back to topics he and Jane had discussed at the museum: ancient languages, historical parallels, philosophical questions about how civilizations interpreted their world. It was almost as though he were deliberately demonstrating their intellectual compatibility, emphasizing the connection between their minds, while politely, but firmly deflecting Mrs. Kensington's matrimonial hints. When they returned to the drawing room after dinner, Elizabeth was persuaded to play the pianoforte, providing a backdrop of gentle music for conversation. The Duke seated himself beside Jane on the small sofa, maintaining a proper distance, but creating a sense of intimacy nevertheless. "Your sister plays well," he observed as Elizabeth began a Beethoven sonata. "She has genuine talent," Jane agreed. "Mother hopes she might make an advantageous match based on her musical accomplishments, if not her beauty." The Duke glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "And what of your accomplishments, Miss Kensington? What talents has your mother encouraged in you?" Jane smiled wryly. "After 7 unsuccessful seasons, my primary accomplishment is discretion, knowing when to remain silent so as not to embarrass my family with unfashionable opinions." "A skill I have yet to master," he said dryly. "Society finds my direct manner disconcerting, particularly when I decline invitations without suitable excuses." "Yet you accepted my mother's invitation," Jane noted, keeping her voice low. "May I ask why, when you must receive dozens of more prestigious ones?" He turned slightly, meeting her gaze directly. "Because I wish to continue our conversation without the constraints of a public setting or hovering academics. Is that not reason enough?" The simple honesty of his answer took her aback. "Yes, I suppose it is. Though you must know your presence here tonight will set tongues wagging throughout Mayfair." "Tongues wag regardless of what I do," he replied with a hint of resignation. After 20 years in society's eye, one becomes somewhat immune to its chatter. Jane was not so certain. The Duke might be immune to gossip, but she was not. If he continued to show her marked attention only to withdraw it later, her already tenuous social position would be irreparably damaged. "Your Grace," she began, then corrected herself. "Lord Queensberry, I value our discussions immensely, but I must confess I'm puzzled by your interest. Surely there are more knowledgeable individuals with whom you might discuss Egyptian antiquities." The Duke studied her face for a moment. "There are many scholars in my acquaintance, certainly, but few who combine knowledge with perception, humor, and refreshing honesty. Fewer still who see beyond titles and positions to the substance beneath. His voice lowered. You spoke with me as a fellow intellect, Miss Kensington, not as a duke to be flattered or a fortune to be secured. Do you know how rare that is? Jane felt heat rise to her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. I spoke as I always do, sir. It's simply that few have bothered to listen. Then society is even more foolish than I had thought. His expression softened. Will you permit me to call again? Perhaps to show you those sketches of Dendera I mentioned. She hesitated, acutely aware of her mother watching them from across the room, of Elizabeth's music providing the perfect cover for what was beginning to feel dangerously like courtship. I would enjoy that, she said carefully, though I fear my mother may attach unwarranted significance to your continued visits. The Duke's mouth curved in a slight smile. Perhaps the significance is not entirely unwarranted, Miss Kensington. Before Jane could process this startling statement, he rose as Elizabeth concluded her performance, joining in the polite applause. The evening drew to a close with conventional pleasantries, the Duke thanking Mrs. Kensington for her hospitality and promising to send his carriage the following week to bring Jane to view his collection of Egyptian artifacts. At the door he took Jane's hand, his touch warm even through her gloves. Until next week, Miss Kensington, I look forward to continuing our discussion. When the door closed behind him, Jane found herself facing her mother and sister's identical expressions of wide-eyed disbelief. Jane, her mother whispered, clutching the back of a chair for support, the Duke of Queensberry is courting you. Don't be absurd, mother. He's merely being kind to someone who shares his scholarly interests. Elizabeth shook her head. I've seen gentlemen being kind before, Jane. This was different. He barely took his eyes off you all evening, and that comment about significance not being unwarranted. That was practically a declaration of intent. Jane moved toward the stairs, suddenly desperate for solitude. You're imagining things, both of you. The Duke is lonely, perhaps. After years abroad, he seeks intellectual companionship. That is all. But as she prepared for bed that night, Jane could not entirely dismiss her sister's observations. There had been something in the Duke's manner, a focused attention, a deliberate courtesy, that went beyond mere scholarly interest. He had researched her family, engaged her mother and sister in conversation, and explicitly stated his desire to continue their acquaintance. Was it possible? Could a duke truly see something of value in plain Jane Kensington? The thought was too dangerous to entertain. Hope had been her enemy for 7 long seasons, each disappointment carving deeper wounds into her pride. She had finally accepted her fate as the unmarriageable Kensington daughter, finding peace in the absence of expectation. To hope again, especially for something as improbable as the interest of one of England's most eligible bachelors, would be to invite devastation when that hope inevitably proved false. No, Jane decided, extinguishing her candle. She would enjoy the Duke's company, value their conversations, and perhaps even count him as a friend. But she would not, under any circumstances, allow herself to imagine more than that. Society's verdict had been rendered long ago. She was too plain for marriage, too forthright for courtship, too ordinary for love. Not even a duke's attention could change that fundamental truth. In the following weeks, London society watched with growing fascination as the Duke of Queensberry's interest in Miss Jane Kensington became increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere scholarly courtesy. He sent his carriage to convey her to his Grosvenor Square mansion, where she spent an afternoon examining his private collection of Egyptian artifacts. He appeared at musical evenings and literary salons where the Kensingtons were in attendance, invariably seeking Jane's company for extended conversations. He was even observed walking beside her carriage in Hyde Park on a Sunday afternoon, a public acknowledgement that set tongues wagging throughout Mayfair. For Jane, these weeks passed in a state of bewildered pleasure. Each encounter with the Duke, who now insisted she call him Vincent in their private conversations, deepened her appreciation for his mind, his dry humor, and his unexpected kindness. He treated her opinions with genuine respect, introduced her to leading scholars in his acquaintance, and seemed to value her company in a way no one ever had before. Yet she maintained her guard, refusing to interpret his attention as anything more than friendship. The Duke had never spoken of warmer feelings, never hinted at romantic intentions beyond that one ambiguous remark about not unwarranted significance. Jane reminded herself daily that men of his position did not marry women like her, plain, poor, and firmly on the shelf at 25. Her mother had no such reservations. Lady Harrington says the betting books at White's have opened a wager on when he'll propose, Mrs. Kensington announced one morning as Jane sat writing in her journal. The odds favour a declaration before the Ashcroft ball next month. Jane set down her pen with a sigh. Gentlemen will bet on anything, mother. Their speculation means nothing. It means society has noticed his interest, Jane. And society is never wrong about these matters. Her mother perched on the edge of the bed, her expression earnest. You must prepare yourself for the possibility of an offer. I am perfectly prepared to be disappointed, Jane replied, more sharply than she intended. Lord Queensberry values my conversation. He finds me a congenial companion for intellectual discussions. That is all. Mrs. Kensington studied her daughter's face. You care for him, don't you? Beyond his title and position, I mean. Jane looked away, uncomfortable with the perception in her mother's gaze. I respect him greatly. His mind is remarkable, and he's been extraordinarily kind. That wasn't my question, dear. After a long pause, Jane admitted the truth she had been trying to deny even to herself. Yes, I care for him, more than I should, given the circumstances. Oh, Jane, her mother's voice softened with unexpected compassion. I've pushed you toward marriage for so many years, never considering that when you finally formed an attachment, it might bring more anxiety than joy. I have no expectations, Jane said firmly. I value his friendship too much to risk it with impossible hopes. Mrs. Kensington rose, smoothing her skirts. Hope is never impossible, my dear, and from what I've observed, the Duke's interest is neither casual nor temporary. She moved to the door, then paused. Whatever happens, know that you deserve happiness, Jane. Not because of your appearance or accomplishments, but because of who you are. The unexpected affirmation brought tears to Jane's eyes. For all her mother's flaws and social ambitions, there was genuine love beneath the desperation to see her daughters settled. 2 days later, Jane received a note delivered by the Duke's private secretary. Miss Kensington, the Royal Archaeological Society is hosting a lecture on recent discoveries at Karnak this evening at 8 o'clock. The speaker, Professor Thornton, has just returned from Egypt with findings that may interest you. If agreeable, my carriage will call for you at 7:30. Yours, Queensberry. Jane stared at the signature, particularly the word yours. A common closing, of course, signifying nothing beyond conventional courtesy. Yet seeing it in his bold handwriting gave it a weight that made her heart beat faster. The lecture was held in the Society's elegant rooms near Piccadilly, where Jane found herself the only woman among some 30 gentlemen of scholarly inclination. The Duke remained beside her throughout the evening, quietly explaining technical terms and introducing her to several prominent archaeologists as a lady of remarkable insight regarding Egyptian symbology. Professor Thornton's presentation included several artifacts recently excavated from a previously undiscovered chamber in the Temple of Karnak. Among them was a small alabaster figurine of a seated woman, her face carved with unusual delicacy. The hieroglyphics identify her as a priestess of Isis, the professor explained, though her specific role remains unclear. The quality of the workmanship suggests royal connections, possibly even a princess serving in the temple. After the formal lecture concluded, attendees were invited to examine the artifacts more closely. The Duke guided Jane to the display table where the alabaster figurine stood. What do you make of her? He asked quietly. Jane studied the small sculpture, noting details the professor had not mentioned. She's holding something in her hands, a scroll, perhaps, and there's an inscription at the base that doesn't match the style of the others. The Duke's eyebrows rose. You've a remarkable eye, Jane. Few would notice that discrepancy. He leaned closer to the figurine, his shoulder brushing hers. You're right, The base inscription appears to be a later addition, possibly from the Ptolemaic period. Could she be a composite figure, then? Part history, part myth. A fascinating hypothesis. The Duke straightened, regarding Jane with undisguised admiration. One worth exploring further. Would you be interested in helping me prepare a paper on the subject for the Society's quarterly publication? Jane stared at him in astonishment. Me, but I have no credentials, no formal training. You have perception, intelligence, and an intuitive understanding of symbolism that many formally educated scholars lack. His voice was firm, brooking no argument. The paper would benefit from your contribution. I would be honored, Jane managed, overwhelmed by the unexpected offer. The Duke smiled, that rare, transformative expression that softened his austere features. Excellent. We can begin tomorrow, if you're available, say 2 o'clock at my library. Later that night, as her mother helped her remove the pins from her hair, Jane recounted the evening's events, including the Duke's invitation to collaborate on a scholarly paper. He values my opinion, Mother, she said, still marveling at the fact. He believes I have something worthwhile to contribute to his research. Mrs. Kensington set down the hairbrush, meeting Jane's eyes in the mirror. Of course he values your opinion, dear, but don't you see? This paper is merely a pretext for spending more time together, in the privacy of his home, without raising eyebrows. Jane frowned. That's a very cynical interpretation. It's a mother's interpretation, Mrs. Kensington corrected. A gentleman doesn't invite a lady to his private library simply to discuss Egyptian priestesses, no matter how interesting they might be. She squeezed Jane's shoulder gently. The Duke is courting you, my dear. In his own scholarly, unconventional way, but courting nonetheless. Jane wanted to dismiss her mother's assessment, but doubt had begun to creep into her carefully maintained defenses. The Duke's attention had been consistent for weeks now. He sought her company specifically, valued her opinions, and seemed genuinely to enjoy their time together. Was it possible that his interest went beyond intellectual companionship? The following afternoon found her in the Duke's magnificent library, a 2-story room lined with thousands of volumes and illuminated by tall windows overlooking a private garden. Maps and artifacts decorated the walls, while comfortable leather chairs and reading tables created intimate spaces for study. This is extraordinary, Jane breathed, turning slowly to take in the vast collection. I could happily spend years in this room. The Duke watched her with evident pleasure. Few appreciate a good library properly. Most visitors comment on the furniture or architecture rather than the books themselves. The furniture is handsome enough, Jane replied, running her fingers along the spine of a leather-bound volume, but it's what's between these covers that matters. Knowledge, ideas, voices from the past, speaking directly to us across centuries. Precisely. Something in his tone made her look up. The Duke was regarding her with an intensity that sent warmth spreading through her chest. You understand. For a moment, they stood in silence, connected by shared appreciation that went beyond words. Then the Duke cleared his throat, gesturing toward a large table where papers and reference materials had been arranged. I've gathered everything we might need for our research on the priestess figurine. Professor Thornton has graciously provided detailed photographs and his preliminary notes. They worked side by side for the next 3 hours, comparing hieroglyphic inscriptions, consulting reference works, and constructing a chronology for the artifact's creation and modification. The Duke treated Jane as a full partner in the research, seeking her opinion on interpretations and acknowledging when her insights surpassed his own. The inscription definitely suggests a connection to the cult of Isis, Jane noted, squinting at a particularly faded hieroglyph. But this symbol here, it's not typically associated with temple priestesses. It appears more often in royal contexts. The Duke leaned closer, his shoulder touching hers as he examined the marking. You're right. It's the Ankh symbol combined with a royal cartouche, suggesting both spiritual and temporal authority. Could she have been a royal princess dedicated to temple service? That might explain the dual symbology. A compelling theory, he straightened, regarding her with frank admiration. one worth developing in our paper. Jane felt herself flush under his approving gaze. Our paper, she repeated softly. It still seems remarkable that you would include me in such a project. The Duke's expression sobered. Why? Because you lack formal credentials. Many of history's greatest thinkers were self-educated, Jane. Academic degrees often indicate privilege more than intelligence. It's not just that, she admitted, setting down her pen. Society has certain expectations about a woman's proper interests. Ancient Egyptian priestesses rarely feature among them. Society, the Duke said with undisguised contempt, rewards conformity and punishes independent thought. Its judgment is rarely worth considering. Easy to say when one is a duke, Jane pointed out with gentle irony. Your position grants immunity from consequences that others must face. He acknowledged this with a rueful nod. True enough, though even dukes are not entirely exempt from society's expectations, particularly regarding marriage and succession. The unexpected introduction of marriage into their scholarly discussion caught Jane off guard. I imagine the pressure to secure the succession must be considerable, she said carefully, increasingly so as one approaches 40 without an heir. The Duke's tone was matter-of-fact, but something in his expression had changed, become more guarded, more deliberate. My steward reminds me of this duty with diplomatic but persistent regularity. Jane's heart beat faster, sensing they had ventured onto dangerous ground. And how do you respond to these reminders? Until recently, with irritation and avoidance. A slight smile touched his lips. I've spent years focusing on ancient civilizations while neglecting my own family's future. A form of scholarly escapism, perhaps. And now, the question slipped out before Jane could reconsider its propriety. The Duke met her gaze directly. Now, I find myself contemplating the possibility of a duchess who might share my intellectual pursuits rather than merely tolerate them. A partner in mind, as well as in the practical matters of estate management and succession. Jane felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The Duke was speaking of marriage, of a duchess, while looking at her with an intensity that could not be misinterpreted. Yet she dared not trust her own perception, not in a matter of such consequence. Such a lady would be fortunate indeed, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, to be valued for her mind rather than more superficial qualities. The fortune would be mutual. The Duke took a step closer, his expression serious. Jane, A discreet knock interrupted whatever he had been about to say. The library door opened to reveal his butler, bearing a silver tray. Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but Lady Harrington is in the drawing room. She insists on seeing you regarding a matter of urgent importance. The Duke's jaw tightened with evident annoyance. Inform Lady Harrington that I am engaged in scholarly research and cannot be disturbed. I did convey that message, Your Grace. Her ladyship indicated that her business concerns Miss Kensington specifically, and that postponement would result in regrettable consequences. Jane felt cold dread settle in her stomach. Lady Harrington, with her network of spies and appetite for scandal, represented a threat that even a duke could not easily dismiss. I should go, she said quickly, gathering her notes. Lady Harrington is not someone one should keep waiting. The Duke placed a hand on hers, stilling her movements. Whatever she wishes to discuss, we can face it together. I have nothing to hide regarding our association. The simple touch of his hand on hers sent warmth radiating up Jane's arm. The protective assertion in his words, we can face it together, suggested a relationship beyond mere scholarly collaboration. Very well, she agreed softly. The Duke offered his arm, which Jane took with only slight hesitation. Together they proceeded to the drawing-room where Lady Harrington waited, resplendent in purple silk and ostrich feathers, her sharp eyes missing nothing as they entered. Your Grace, she said, rising to curtsy with remarkable agility for a woman of her years. Miss Kensington, how cozy to find you in the Duke's private library. Researching Egyptian antiquities, I understand. The arch tone left no doubt that Lady Harrington considered Egyptian antiquities a transparent euphemism for something far less proper. "Indeed," the Duke replied coolly. "Miss Kensington and I are preparing a paper for the Archaeological Society on a recently discovered artifact. Her insights have proven invaluable." "How modern of you to engage in scholarly pursuits with an unmarried lady," Lady Harrington observed, seating herself again with a rustle of silk. "Though I fear London society may place a less charitable interpretation on your tete-a-tetes." Jane felt herself stiffen at the implied impropriety. "Our work has been conducted with complete propriety, Lady Harrington. The Duke's secretary has been present throughout." This was not entirely true. The secretary had departed after the first hour, but Jane saw no reason to provide the old gossip with additional ammunition. "Of course, my dear. I wouldn't suggest otherwise." Lady Harrington's smile was razor-sharp. "However, perception often matters more than reality in these situations, which brings me to the purpose of my visit." The Duke guided Jane to a chair before taking one himself, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. "And what might that purpose be, Lady Harrington?" "To warn you both." The elderly woman's voice lost its affected drawl, becoming unexpectedly direct. "Your association has attracted notice at the highest levels of society." The Dowager Countess of Melbury was heard remarking at Lady Jersey's reception yesterday that the Duke of Queensberry has developed a peculiar fascination with the plain Kensington girl, and that his scholarly eccentricities have clearly affected his judgment. Jane felt each word like a physical blow, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. The Dowager Countess of Melbury was one of society's most influential arbiters, her opinion capable of making or breaking reputations. "Lady Melbury is entitled to her opinion," the Duke said dismissively. "As am I to mine. Miss Kensington's intelligence and perception far outweigh the superficial qualities that society values in young ladies." Lady Harrington raised an eyebrow. "A commendable sentiment, Your Grace, but we both know society is rarely so enlightened. The gossip might be manageable if confined to comments about Miss Kensington's appearance, but I fear it has taken a more damaging turn." "What do you mean?" Jane asked, dreading the answer. "There are whispers, entirely unfounded, I'm sure, that your family has engineered this connection through some form of manipulation. That Mrs. Kensington, desperate to secure a match for her unmarriageable daughter, has somehow coerced your Grace's attention." The Duke's expression darkened. "That is absurd and offensive. My interest in Miss Kensington is entirely self-directed." "I believe you," Lady Harrington said calmly, "but others may not, particularly when the disparity in your positions is so pronounced." She turned to Jane. "My dear, I bear you no ill will. Quite the contrary, I find your situation poignantly familiar." "Familiar?" Jane echoed in confusion. A shadow passed over the older woman's face. "I was once a plain girl from a good family with more intelligence than beauty. I too caught the attention of a titled gentleman who valued my conversation. And I too became the subject of vicious speculation that ultimately destroyed any chance of a respectable match with him." Jane had never heard this personal detail about Lady Harrington's past. The revelation of vulnerability from London's most formidable gossip was startling. "What happened?" she asked softly. "Society made it impossible," Lady Harrington replied, her usual sharpness momentarily absent. "The whispers, the snide remarks, the cruel jests, they wore him down until he could no longer separate his own judgment from the opinions being forced upon him. He began to see me through society's eyes rather than his own." The Duke leaned forward. "I am not so easily influenced, Lady Harrington." "Perhaps not, but Miss Kensington's reputation is more vulnerable than yours. Already there are suggestions that she has entrapped you through some form of inappropriate behavior." The elderly woman's gaze was direct. "If your interest is merely scholarly, Your Grace, I suggest you make that abundantly clear by restricting your contact to public settings with proper chaperonage." Jane felt cold, despite the warm room. Lady Harrington was right, her reputation hung by a thread. If society decided she had attempted to entrap the Duke or behaved improperly to attract his attention, she would be ruined. Not just unmarriageable, but ostracized. And if my interest extends beyond the scholarly, the Duke asked quietly. Lady Harrington studied him with shrewd assessment. Then you must declare it openly and formally with the clear intention of marriage. Nothing less will silence the gossips or protect Miss Kensington from their venom. Marriage, the word hung in the air between them, charged with implications that Jane scarcely dared consider. I see, the Duke said after a long pause. Your counsel is appreciated, Lady Harrington, though your method of delivery leaves something to be desired. The old woman rose, gathering her shawl. Desperate situations call for direct approaches, Your Grace. I've survived 50 years in London society by recognizing which whispers represent genuine threat and which are merely idle chatter. She turned to Jane. My dear, whatever happens, hold fast to your dignity. It may be all you have left when society finishes with you. With that ominous parting, Lady Harrington swept from the room, leaving Jane and the Duke in troubled silence. I should go, Jane said finally, rising from her chair. Lady Harrington is right. My presence here risks both our reputations. The Duke stood as well, his expression troubled. Jane, wait. We need to discuss this situation rationally. There's nothing rational about society's gossip, she replied, gathering her shawl with trembling hands. I was a fool to think I could enter your world without consequences. My world, he stepped closer, his voice softening. Jane, you've created a division that doesn't exist. We share interests, values, perspectives. That connection transcends artificial social boundaries. But those boundaries are real, Vincent. It was the first time she had used his given name outside of academic discussion, and the intimacy of it seemed to catch them both by surprise. You're a duke. I'm the plain, unmarriageable daughter of a baronet's widow. Society will never accept. She broke off, realizing she had been about to articulate expectations she had no right to hold. Accept what? He prompted gently. Jane squared her shoulders, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Whatever this is between us, friendship, scholarly collaboration, society requires neat categories for relationships, particularly between men and women. Ours defies such categorization. The Duke, Vincent, studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate care, he took her hand in his. Perhaps because it isn't yet what it's meant to be, he said quietly. Lady Harrington suggested I must either restrict our contact to public settings or declare my intentions formally. There is, of course, a third option. Jane held her breath, afraid to hope, yet unable to stifle the flutter of anticipation in her chest. What option is that? I could court you properly, he said, his voice low but clear. With your mother's permission, calls at appropriate hours, chaperoned outings, all the conventional steps that would make my intentions clear without rushing to a formal declaration before we're both certain. Court her. The Duke of Queensberry wanted to court plain Jane Kensington with all the public acknowledgement that entailed. But why? The question escaped before she could reconsider its wisdom. Vincent, you could have any woman in England. Beautiful, accomplished ladies with substantial dowries and impeccable connections. Why would you choose someone society has deemed too plain for marriage? His hand tightened on hers, because society is wrong, Jane. About you, about what matters, about nearly everything of consequence. He drew a breath, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. I choose you because in your company I find both intellectual stimulation and emotional peace. Because your mind challenges mine, and your integrity reminds me of values I've sometimes neglected in pursuit of academic recognition. Jane stood very still, hardly daring to breathe as he continued. I choose you because when we discuss ancient civilizations or debate historical interpretations, I catch glimpses of a partnership I never thought possible. One based on mutual respect and genuine interest rather than social convenience. Vincent, she whispered, overwhelmed by his words. Will you allow me to court you, Jane, to discover whether what I believe we might build together is indeed possible? The moment stretched between them, fraught with possibilities. Jane knew her answer would alter the course of both their lives, for better or worse. Yes, she said simply, her voice steadier than she felt. "Though I fear you may come to regret attaching yourself to someone society considers so thoroughly inadequate." Vincent's expression softened, his free hand rising to touch her cheek with gentle fingers. "The only regret would be allowing others' misperceptions to separate us before we've explored what might be." His touch sent warmth cascading through her, and Jane allowed herself, for the first time, to acknowledge the full depth of her feelings for this complex, brilliant man. It wasn't just his mind she admired or his kindness she valued. Somewhere during their weeks of conversation and shared discovery, she had fallen in love with Vincent Queensberry, not the Duke, but the man beneath the title. A love that seemed miraculous and terrifying in equal measure. "Then we shall explore," she agreed softly, "with proper chaperonage, of course." His low laugh held genuine amusement. "Of course, though I warn you, my interest in Egyptian priestesses remains entirely academic." Jane smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "As does mine, Lord Queensberry, as does mine." The following morning, Vincent's carriage delivered a formal letter to Manchester Square addressed to Mrs. Kensington. In it, the Duke requested permission to pay his addresses to Miss Jane Kensington, with the clear intention of determining their compatibility for marriage. The household erupted into barely controlled chaos when the letter's contents became known. Mrs. Kensington alternated between tears of joy and frantic planning, while Elizabeth bounced from room to room, exclaiming over the romantic wonder of it all. "A duke, Jane, after all these years you've captured a duke," her mother kept saying, clutching the letter to her breast. "Lady Harrington will choke on her morning chocolate when she hears." Jane maintained a calm exterior, despite the tumult of emotions within. "He's requested permission to court me, mother, not proposed marriage. There's a significant difference." "Nonsense, no duke courts without intention to wed, it would be beneath his dignity." Mrs. Kensington was already mentally redecorating the drawing room for the engagement announcement. "We must order new gowns for you immediately. The blue silk is entirely inadequate for the future Duchess of Queensberry." "Mother, please," Jane protested, feeling a headache forming behind her eyes. "Nothing is decided. Lord Queensberry wishes to determine whether we're compatible, a sensible approach given our different backgrounds." Elizabeth paused in her excited circuit of the room. "Compatible, Jane, you've spent weeks discussing ancient Egypt and heaven knows what other dusty subjects. If you're not compatible, no couple in England is." Jane couldn't help smiling at her sister's romantic assessment. "Intellectual compatibility is only one consideration in marriage, Lizzie. There are practical matters as well, his position, his duties, his expectations for a duchess." "You'll manage beautifully," her mother declared with newfound confidence. "You've always had a natural dignity, Jane. With proper guidance and a duchess's wardrobe, you'll astonish society." The rest of the day passed in a similar vein, with Mrs. Kensington drafting an effusive acceptance of the Duke's request and planning a dinner party to celebrate the courtship. Jane retreated to her room whenever possible, trying to process the extraordinary turn her life had taken. Just weeks ago, she had been resigned to spinsterhood, her future stretching before her in a predictable pattern of chaperoning younger ladies and eventual dependence on whatever relations might take her in when her mother passed. Now, almost overnight, she faced the possibility of becoming a duchess, mistress of vast estates, and wife to one of England's most powerful men. It was terrifying, not because Jane doubted her feelings for Vincent. Those had crystallized during their conversation in his library, when she recognized that what she felt went far beyond admiration or intellectual attraction. She loved him, his mind, his integrity, his unexpected kindness beneath the austere exterior. No, what terrified Jane was the prospect of failing him. Of being inadequate to the role of duchess, of embarrassing him in society, of proving incapable of managing the responsibilities that came with his title. She had no fortune to bring to the marriage, no powerful connections to benefit his position, none of the beauty or accomplishments that society expected in a duke's bride. The whispers would be merciless, that he had married beneath him, that she had somehow entrapped him, that his scholarly eccentricity had clouded his judgment. Could their connection, however genuine, withstand such constant undermining? Or would Vincent eventually come to see her through society's critical eyes, just as Lady Harrington's gentleman had decades ago? These fears accompanied Jane the following afternoon when the Duke called formally at Manchester Square. Mrs. Kensington had spent the morning ensuring the drawing-room was immaculate, coaching Elizabeth on appropriate conversation topics, and supervising Jane's appearance with unprecedented attention to detail. "Remember, dear, animation, charm, and do mention how much you've always admired Derbyshire," she instructed for the dozenth time as the butler announced the Duke's arrival. Vincent entered with the composed dignity that came naturally to him, though Jane detected a hint of tension in the set of his shoulders. This was, after all, a significant departure from their usual scholarly interactions, the first formal step in a courtship that would place them both under society's unforgiving scrutiny. "Mrs. Kensington," he said, bowing over her hand. "Miss Kensington." His eyes met Jane's with warmth that belied his formal tone. "Miss Elizabeth." "Your Grace," Mrs. Kensington gushed, "we're honored by your visit. And may I say how delighted we are by your interest in our Jane. Such a surprise, though of course we've always known her true worth, even when society failed to appreciate it." Jane winced inwardly at her mother's transparent reference to her previous lack of suitors, but Vincent merely inclined his head with perfect courtesy. "Society's oversight has been my extraordinary good fortune," he replied. "Miss Kensington's qualities are rare and valuable, all the more so for being unrecognized by those lacking discernment." The diplomatic response elevated Jane's lack of success from social failure to evidence of society's poor judgment, a reframing so skillful that even Mrs. Kensington appeared momentarily speechless. "Would you care for refreshment, Your Grace?" Elizabeth asked, filling the silence. "We have Cook's excellent lemon cakes, and Jane prepared the tea herself." "Thank you, Miss Elizabeth. Tea would be most welcome." The conversation that followed was strained in its formality, with Mrs. Kensington making valiant but transparent efforts to highlight Jane's domestic virtues alongside her intellectual ones. "Jane manages our household accounts with remarkable efficiency," she informed the Duke as he accepted a cup of tea. "And her embroidery, while not as fashionable as some, shows exceptional precision. Mathematical, almost, in its execution." "Mother," Jane protested quietly, embarrassed by this clumsy attempt to present her as both blue-stocking and traditional lady. Vincent's eyes held a glint of amusement. "I have no doubt Miss Kensington approaches all tasks with intelligence and care. It's a quality I've observed in her scholarly pursuits." "You're too kind, Your Grace," Jane murmured, wishing they could dispense with this awkward formality and return to their natural conversation. As if sensing her discomfort, Vincent changed the subject. "I've brought something that might interest you, Miss Kensington." He reached inside his coat and produced a small package wrapped in tissue. "A token of my esteem." Jane accepted it with curiosity, carefully unwrapping the delicate paper. Inside lay a small bronze scarab beetle, ancient in its craftsmanship but beautifully preserved, mounted on a simple silver chain. "It's beautiful," she breathed, turning the scarab to catch the light. The intricate details of the beetle's carapace gleamed with the patina of centuries. 18th dynasty, Vincent explained. "From a temple near Luxor. The hieroglyphics on the underside are a protection spell. May wisdom guide your path through darkness into light." Jane ran her finger over the tiny inscriptions, deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. Not jewels or conventional trinkets, but an artifact that connected to their shared passion for history. "I shall treasure it," she said simply, meeting his eyes with unguarded emotion. Mrs. Kensington cleared her throat. "How very unusual, Your Grace. Most gentlemen begin courtship with flowers or perhaps a book of poetry." "Jane is not most ladies," Vincent replied, his gaze still on Jane's face. "Conventional gifts would hardly be appropriate." The remainder of the visit passed more comfortably, with discussion of an upcoming exhibition at the British Museum and plans for a carriage ride through Hyde Park later in the week, properly chaperoned by Mrs. Kensington, of course. When Vincent took his leave after the prescribed half-hour, he requested a brief private word with Jane in the presence of her mother. Mrs. Kensington retreated to the far end of the drawing-room, maintaining a pretense of examining a landscape painting while straining to overhear their conversation. "I know this formal courtship feels artificial after our scholarly discussions," Vincent said quietly, taking Jane's hand. "But it's necessary for your reputation and to make my intentions clear to society." "I understand," Jane assured him. "Though I must warn you, my mother's enthusiasm may become overwhelming. She's already planning the wedding breakfast." Vincent smiled, that rare expression that transformed his austere features. "Let her plan. Our courtship need not be lengthy if we find ourselves as compatible in conventional settings as we are in the library." The implication sent warmth spreading through Jane's chest. "You're very confident, Your Grace." "In some matters, yes." His expression sobered slightly, "though I'm well aware that my position brings complications you may not have fully considered. A duchess faces scrutiny and expectations far beyond what you've experienced." "I've thought of little else," Jane admitted. "I fear I may disappoint you, or worse, embarrass you before your peers." Vincent's fingers tightened around hers. "Impossible. Your intelligence and integrity will serve you better than all the social polish of a dozen debutantes. The rest is merely performance, easily learned if one has the wit to recognize it as such." His confidence in her was both touching and terrifying. Jane wished she could share it, but years of society's dismissal had left deeper scars than she had realized. "I hope you're right," she said softly. "I usually am," he replied, with a hint of the arrogance that his position had inevitably fostered. "Though I welcome correction when I'm not, another reason we suit each other so well." After he departed, Jane was subjected to her mother's detailed analysis of every word, gesture, and expression that had passed between them. "He's completely smitten," Mrs. Kensington declared. "That scarab necklace, so personal, so intimate, and the way he looked at you when you opened it, I've never seen the Duke express such emotion." "It was a thoughtful gift," Jane agreed, touching the ancient beetle that now hung around her neck. "Though hardly proof of being completely smitten." "Nonsense. A man doesn't give ancient Egyptian artifacts to a woman unless he's deeply attached. Flowers can be sent to anyone. A historical treasure speaks of genuine regard." Her mother clasped her hands in satisfaction. "I predict an offer within the month." Elizabeth, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet throughout much of the visit, finally spoke. "Do you love him, Jane?" The direct question caught Jane off guard. "I admire and respect him greatly." "That's not what I asked." Elizabeth's pretty face was unusually serious. "Mother's right, the Duke clearly feels something profound for you. But do you love him? Not his title or position, but him." Jane hesitated, unwilling to expose her most vulnerable feelings, even to her sister. Yet Elizabeth's question deserved honesty. "Yes," she admitted quietly, "though I scarcely allowed myself to recognize it until yesterday." Elizabeth's expression softened. "Good. Because I think he loves you too, though he's too proper to declare it yet. The way he watches you when you're speaking, as though every word matters deeply to him. I've never seen a gentleman look at a lady that way." "Don't be fanciful, Lizzie. The Duke appreciates my mind and finds me a compatible companion. That's a more rational basis for marriage than most." "If you say so." Elizabeth's smile was knowing, "though I suspect there's more to it than rational compatibility. That scarab necklace wasn't chosen by a man seeking merely a suitable wife." Jane's fingers went to the bronze beetle again, feeling its weight against her skin, solid, ancient, enduring. Like Vincent himself, it represented something beyond the fleeting fashions and superficial values of London society. Over the next 2 weeks, their courtship proceeded along conventional lines, though with subtle differences that reflected their unique connection. Instead of frivolous compliments, Vincent offered intelligent conversation. In place of fashionable outings, he escorted Jane to museums and private collections. Rather than trinkets and flowers, he brought her rare books and scholarly journals with passages marked for her attention. Each encounter deepened Jane's feelings and conviction that Vincent saw her truly, not as society did, not even as her family did, but as she was at her core. With him, she felt no need to disguise her intelligence or temper her opinions. He valued precisely what others had criticized or dismissed. For the first time in her life, Jane began to believe that perhaps she was not inadequate after all, merely misplaced in a society that valued appearance over substance, conformity over independent thought. The courtship did not progress without challenges, however. True to Lady Harrington's warning, society's reaction ranged from disbelief to outright mockery. Whispers followed Jane whenever she appeared in public, and invitations that had previously been extended to the Kensington family were mysteriously rescinded. "It's nothing short of persecution," Mrs. Kensington declared after 3 notes of regret arrived in a single morning. Pure jealousy, of course. The Pembroke Smythes had been trying to attract the Duke's attention for their daughter Emily for 2 seasons without success. Jane tried to maintain her composure despite the growing isolation. "It doesn't matter, Mother. We expected some resistance." Resistance, yes. Complete social ostracism, no. Her mother waved the latest rejection note indignantly. "Lady Winchester has been my friend for 20 years, yet suddenly her dinner party is regrettably oversubscribed. Nonsense. She simply doesn't wish to acknowledge your new status." "I have no new status," Jane pointed out reasonably. "The Duke is courting me, not engaged to me. Until he makes a formal offer, if he does, society is free to treat me as they always have." With slightly more contempt, Elizabeth added from her perch by the window. "Mrs. Harwood crossed the street yesterday rather than acknowledge us in the park, as though Jane's connection to the Duke might be contagious." Vincent was not blind to these developments. During their carriage ride in Hyde Park the following day, he noted how several acquaintances averted their gaze rather than greet them. "Society's pettiness never ceases to amaze me," he remarked, his jaw tightening as a viscountess deliberately turned her back as they passed. "Though I confess I expected more courage from Lady Pembroke, at least. She's known you since childhood." Jane adjusted her parasol to shield her face from more than just the sun. "Don't be too harsh in your judgment. They're behaving according to established patterns. A duke courting a plain, dowerless spinster violates the natural order of things." Vincent's hand covered hers where it rested on the carriage seat. "Then, the natural order requires revision. Your worth far exceeds that of the empty-headed debutantes they would have me consider." "Yet you must admit the situation is unusual," Jane persisted, needing him to acknowledge the reality they faced. "In their position, would you not question the wisdom of such a match?" He was silent for a moment, his profile stern against the green backdrop of the park. "Perhaps once I might have," he finally admitted. "Before I understood that true compatibility involves far more than superficial considerations. But Jane," he turned to face her directly, "their disapproval changes nothing about my intentions or my assessment of your worth." The courtship reached a turning point 3 weeks after it began, at the Ashcroft Ball, the social event of the late season, where attendance was considered essential for anyone claiming position in society. Mrs. Kensington had been in despair when no invitation arrived at Manchester Square, despite their long-standing connection to Lady Ashcroft through Jane's late father. "It's a deliberate slight," she lamented. "Everyone who matters will be there, and our absence will be noted and commented upon. It will appear that even the Duke's interest has not elevated us from obscurity." Jane had accepted the exclusion with outward calm, though inwardly she felt the sting of rejection. Not for herself, she had never enjoyed such elaborate social functions, but for what it signified about her relationship with Vincent. If society refused to accept their connection, how could they build a life together without constant struggle? Then, 2 days before the ball, a messenger arrived from Grosvenor Square bearing a note in Vincent's distinctive hand. "My dear Jane, I've been informed of Lady Ashcroft's inexcusable oversight regarding your family's invitation to Friday's ball. The situation has been rectified. A formal invitation will arrive this afternoon, and I would be honored if you would attend as my guest. Your mother and sister are, of course, included. With deepest regard. Vincent." The note, passed from hand to hand among the Kensington women, prompted very different reactions. "Rectified," Mrs. Kensington crowed triumphantly. "He's put Lady Ashcroft in her place. Oh, I would have given anything to witness that conversation." "How romantic," Elizabeth sighed. He's publicly declaring his allegiance to you, Jane. No one will dare slight you now. But Jane felt only discomfort at Vincent's intervention. He shouldn't have done this. Forcing Lady Ashcroft to invite us will only create resentment. Who cares about her resentment? Her mother demanded. She behaved abominably, and the Duke has simply corrected an injustice. Using his power and position to override her wishes, Jane pointed out. It's precisely this sort of action that reinforces society's worst assumptions about our relationship, that I've somehow manipulated him into championing me. That's absurd, Elizabeth protested. He's acting as any gentleman would to protect the woman he loves from insult. Is he? Jane stared at the note, troubled by its implications. Or is he using his rank to impose his will, as he's undoubtedly accustomed to doing in all aspects of his life? For the first time, Jane confronted a fundamental question about their relationship. Did Vincent truly see her as an equal partner, or was his interest in her merely an extension of his habitual authority, selecting a wife as he might select a particularly interesting artifact for his collection? The question lingered as she prepared for the Ashcroft ball, haunting her even as she donned the new gown her mother had insisted upon ordering. A creation of midnight blue silk that the modiste had assured them would transform Jane from plain to striking, if not quite beautiful. The colour brings out the gold flecks in your eyes, Elizabeth observed as Jane studied her reflection with critical attention. And the cut is far more flattering than your old gowns. It was true. The gown, more sophisticated than anything Jane had previously worn, created an illusion of height and grace. With her hair arranged in a more becoming style and the bronze scarab nestled at her throat, she looked different. Not conventionally pretty like Elizabeth, but distinctive, present rather than invisible. The Duke's carriage collected them promptly at 9, though Vincent himself did not accompany it. He would meet them at the ball, having been obligated to attend a diplomatic dinner beforehand. This arrangement only increased Jane's anxiety. Arriving without his immediate protection meant facing society's reaction alone, at least initially. Lady Ashcroft's Mayfair mansion blazed with light, carriages queued along the street, disgorging elegantly dressed guests. As the Kensington ladies joined the procession up the marble staircase, Jane felt the weight of curious stares and heard the murmur of whispers that followed their progress. "Courage, dear," her mother whispered, gripping her arm with unexpected strength. "You are the chosen companion of the Duke of Queensberry. Hold your head high." Jane straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to meet the gaze of those who stared. She would not cower or apologize for Vincent's attention, regardless of society's judgment. At the entrance to the ballroom, Lady Ashcroft greeted them with brittle politeness, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Mrs. Kensington, how? Unexpected to see you this evening. And Miss Kensington, both Miss Kensingtons, how lovely." "Lady Ashcroft," Jane's mother replied with equal insincerity. "Such a magnificent gathering. So kind of you to include us." The unspoken acknowledgement of the forced invitation hung between them for a moment before Lady Ashcroft turned to welcome the next arrivals, effectively dismissing them from her attention. The ballroom was a glittering spectacle of crystal chandeliers, hothouse flowers, and fashionable attire. The cream of London society filled the space, their jewels catching the light as they moved through the complex patterns of social interaction that Jane had observed but never fully participated in during her 7 seasons. "There's Lady Harrington," Elizabeth murmured, nodding toward the elderly gossip who held court near a marble column, surrounded by eager listeners. "She's watching us most intently." "Let her watch, Mrs. Kensington said with newfound confidence. "When the Duke arrives, she'll have something genuine to report for once." But an hour passed with no sign of Vincent. Jane stood with her mother and sister near the refreshment table, painfully aware of the empty space around them where other guests might have engaged them in conversation. They were present but isolated, included in body but excluded in spirit. "Perhaps the diplomatic dinner has run late," her mother suggested, though worry had begun to crease her forehead. "Ambassadors can be terribly long-winded, I'm told." "I'm sure that's it," Jane agreed, though doubt had begun to gnaw at her composure. Had Vincent reconsidered? Had the pressure of society's disapproval finally outweighed his interest in her? As the orchestra began a lively quadrille, Elizabeth was approached by a young lieutenant who requested her hand for the dance. Mrs. Kensington practically pushed her youngest daughter forward, eager for at least one of them to participate in the festivities. Left with only her mother for company, Jane felt more conspicuous than ever. Several matrons nearby were watching them with barely disguised curiosity, whispering behind their fans. "I believe I'll get some air," Jane said quietly. "The room is rather warm." "Don't go far," her mother cautioned. "The Duke may arrive any moment." Jane made her way to a small antechamber off the main ballroom, a space designed for quiet conversation away from the music and dancing. It was blessedly empty, and she moved to a window overlooking the garden, drawing a deep breath of cooler air. The scarab necklace felt heavy against her skin, a tangible reminder of the connection that had brought her to this uncomfortable situation. Vincent had given it to her with such evident meaning, treating her as someone worthy of a unique and personal gift. Yet tonight, his absence spoke louder than any token of affection. Miss Kensington. Seeking refuge from the festivities. The voice, cultured and female, came from behind her. Jane turned to find the Dowager Countess of Melbury regarding her with cool assessment. At 65, Lady Melbury remained a formidable presence in society, her word capable of making or breaking reputations with a single observation. "Lady Melbury," Jane curtsied, her throat suddenly dry. "I was merely enjoying a moment of quiet." "Quite understandable. These affairs can be tedious, particularly when one finds oneself unexpectedly included." The older woman moved closer, her silk gown rustling like dry leaves. "I confess, I've been curious to meet you, the lady who has captured the Duke of Queensberry's attention after so many failed to do so." Jane maintained her composure with effort. "His Grace has been kind enough to appreciate my interest in historical scholarship. We share many intellectual pursuits." "How fascinating!" Lady Melbury's tone suggested it was anything but. "Though I wonder if intellectual pursuits alone explain his marked attention to a young lady who has been on the marriage mart for— how many seasons is it now?" "7, Jane replied evenly, refusing to show embarrassment. "Though I ceased to have expectations of marriage some time ago." "Until the Duke appeared," Lady Melbury observed. "A most fortunate development for the Kensington family, particularly given your limited prospects otherwise." The insult was delivered with such polished grace that it took Jane a moment to absorb its full sting. When she did, something hardened within her, a core of dignity that 7 seasons of rejection had tested but never broken. "My family's circumstances are indeed modest compared to His Grace's," she acknowledged calmly. "But genuine connection rarely concerns itself with such disparities." Lady Melbury's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Connection? Is that what you call it? Society has other terms for the relationship between a wealthy, powerful man and a lady of limited means and unremarkable attributes." Jane felt heat rise to her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "What term would you suggest, Lady Melbury? Friendship, mutual respect, intellectual compatibility, all seem more accurate than whatever insinuation you're attempting to make." The Dowager Countess's expression sharpened. "You have spirit, Miss Kensington, more than your appearance suggests. Perhaps that explains some of the Duke's interest, though not, I think, all of it." "I cannot presume to explain His Grace's motivations," Jane replied. "Nor, I suspect, can you." "Perhaps not." Lady Melbury adjusted her diamond bracelet with deliberate attention. "Though I have known Vincent Queensberry since he was a boy visiting my late husband's estate. He has always been susceptible to unusual enthusiasms, Egyptian tombs, obscure languages, and now," her gaze swept over Jane dismissively. "Well, collecting the overlooked can become a habit, I suppose." The words struck Jane with unexpected force. Collecting the overlooked, was that how Vincent saw her? Another unusual acquisition to add to his eclectic collection of interests. "His Grace is not here this evening," Lady Melbury continued, watching Jane's face carefully. "I understand the diplomatic dinner concluded an hour ago. Curious that he has not yet appeared to support the lady he has so publicly singled out for attention." Before Jane could formulate a response, Another voice spoke from the doorway, deep, authoritative, and unmistakably angry. "Not curious at all, Lady Melbury, when one's carriage breaks an axle on these abominably maintained London streets." Vincent stood framed in the entrance, his evening attire slightly dishevelled, his expression thunderous as he surveyed the scene before him. "Your Grace," Lady Melbury executed a perfect curtsy, though her eyes remained calculating. "How unfortunate about your carriage, though it seems you've arrived in time to rescue Miss Kensington from isolation." "Miss Kensington appears perfectly capable of managing without rescue," Vincent replied coldly. "Though I confess I'm curious about what warranted your personal attention this evening. You rarely engage with those you consider beneath your notice." The Dowager Countess's composure did not waver. "Merely satisfying my curiosity about the lady who has drawn you back into society after so many years of scholarly seclusion. I find her not what I expected." "Few things of genuine value are what one expects, Lady Melbury." Vincent moved to Jane's side, his hand coming to rest protectively at the small of her back. "Which is why discerning minds learn to look beyond superficial assessment." Lady Melbury's smile was thin. "A philosopher as well as an archaeologist. How impressive. I shall leave you to your intellectual companion, Your Grace, Miss Kensington, enlightening to make your acquaintance." With a rustle of expensive silk, she departed, leaving Jane and Vincent alone in the antechamber. "I apologize for my tardiness," he said immediately, his expression softening as he turned to Jane. "The axle broke near Piccadilly, and finding another conveyance took unconscionable time." "You needn't apologize," Jane assured him, though relief at his arrival warred with the doubts Lady Melbury had planted. "These things happen." Vincent studied her face with the intense focus she had come to recognize as his natural expression when confronted with something that required understanding. "You're troubled," he observed. Was Lady Melbury's conversation as unpleasant as I suspect? Jane hesitated, uncertain how to articulate the complex emotions swirling within her. She merely expressed what many are thinking, that your interest in me is an extension of your unusual enthusiasms. Another curiosity to add to your collection. His jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath the skin. "And you believe this assessment?" "I don't know what to believe," Jane admitted, the doubts she had been suppressing finally finding voice. "Your attention has been consistent and seemingly sincere. Yet I cannot help wondering if you truly understand what you're doing, aligning yourself with someone society deems so thoroughly unsuitable." "Society," Vincent said with quiet intensity, "has never dictated my choices and never will." "I thought you understood that about me." "I understand that you're accustomed to imposing your will regardless of opposition," Jane countered. "Your intervention with Lady Ashcroft regarding our invitation demonstrates as much. But marriage, if that is indeed your intention, cannot be approached with the same autocratic certainty. You object to my securing your invitation." His brows drew together in confusion. "Would you have preferred to be excluded from an event where my absence would have left you vulnerable to precisely the sort of interaction I just witnessed?" "I would prefer not to be in a position where your protection is required at all," Jane replied, voicing the fear that had grown alongside her deepening feelings for him. "A marriage where one party must constantly shield the other from society's contempt is built on unequal ground." Vincent was silent for a long moment, his expression shifting from confusion to something more complex, a mixture of realization and regret. "I've approached this incorrectly," he finally said, his voice lowered to ensure privacy. "In my determination to demonstrate my interest publicly, I've created precisely the dynamic you fear, casting myself as protector rather than partner." "It was perhaps inevitable," Jane said softly, "given our respective positions." "No," he took her hands in his touch warm and steady. "It was the result of my failure to articulate what I truly value in our connection. Jane, when I speak of intellectual compatibility, I'm not describing a collector's appreciation for an unusual specimen. I'm describing the foundation of genuine partnership, one where both parties contribute equally, if differently." Jane wanted to believe him, desperately so, but Lady Melbury's words still echoed in her mind. Even if that's true, we cannot ignore reality. I bring nothing to this alliance but myself, no fortune, no powerful connections, none of the attributes society values in a duchess. You bring everything that matters, Vincent insisted, his grip tightening on her hands. Intelligence, integrity, perception, kindness, the capacity to see beyond titles and wealth to the person beneath. Do you have any idea how rare that is in my world, how precious? His voice had taken on an intensity Jane had never heard before, a raw emotional honesty that contrasted sharply with his usual controlled demeanor. I began this courtship with rational intentions, he continued, seeking a compatible companion who shared my interests and might make a suitable duchess. But somewhere between Egyptian priestesses and scarab beetles, rationality gave way to something far more profound. Jane held her breath, afraid to hope, yet unable to suppress the flutter of anticipation in her chest. I love you, Jane Kensington, Vincent said simply, not for what you might become or what you represent, but for who you are. Plain or beautiful, rich or poor, these considerations are meaningless beside the essential truth that I cannot imagine my future without you in it. The declaration, spoken with quiet certainty in a deserted antechamber while a ball continued in the next room, was so far from the conventional proposal Jane might once have dreamed of that she almost laughed. Instead, tears filled her eyes, not of sorrow but of overwhelming relief and joy. I love you too, she whispered, the words she had scarcely allowed herself to acknowledge even in private. Though I've been terrified to admit it, even to myself, the disparity between us seemed too great to overcome. Vincent's expression softened,